on the front row, but I think, you know, no one's going to attack you or ask impromptu questions. We might, okay, but I don't want to scare people off now. We can do this later. So, guys, if you want to just please come and sit here on the front. That's the first thing I wanted to say. Second thing is about technical difficulties that we're currently having with the people connected online, because for some reason technology is not trustworthy, right? And we always say we depend on non-European technology, we should have trustworthy solutions. Now our typical system at the moment is actually down, and doesn't depend on us. There's a problem of the system itself. So we've looked for a plan B. And this plan B is hopefully one way or another working, but it's going to come up with some shortcomings which might take the form of and the shape of relatively low volume, which is actually a trick that we use so that everybody in the room has to be completely silent, with people connected online actually intervene. Anyway, hopefully it's not going to be too disruptive, and this gives us a possibility at least to get started. And once we get started, we'll see and we'll figure it out once the moment comes, because two of our speakers in this first panel actually connected online. Again, Rutger Hoekstra, you see him, and Sandrine Dixon. At least you can wave your hands because you can hear us. Now let's see if we can hear you when the moment comes. Right. So how did this event come about? It's a rather, complex and articulate way. It actually started with two different directions, right? Which something that both Cinzia Alcidi, my colleague here and senior fellow at CEPS in charge of economic policy and jobs and skills, was working on, and another stream I was working on. And on the side of Cinzia, it was actually hosting a presentation of work that you will see now presented here. And you will see, well, the two moderators actually swapped, right? This is a part that Cinzia would have brought to the conference of keen interest to me as well, for the reasons that I will explain, and a conversation that I had with Martin Porter and the Cambridge Institute of Sustainable Leadership on how to put together some of the pieces of research that we had developed over the years that have been launched in our case at CEPS a while ago, and then the new index of competitive sustainability has been launched much more recently and will be operationalized also even more in the future, which is basically putting together an idea that I put forward almost ironically when I was a fellow in DigiGrow as one side activity in 2023, by looking at what is the North Star that the European Commission in the form of von der Leyen mandate actually pursued, and finding that this North Star was a bit confusing because it was shifting constantly. And so for any sailor, as you can see, if the North Star changes, it's complicated if you have shocks and thunderstorms and technical problems like ours on the boat and so on. But if on top of this you actually don't even know where to go, that's a bit complicated, right? And what the Cambridge Institute, CISL, the Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Leadership, was doing in terms of building an index of competitive sustainability, which was actually interesting because competitive sustainability was one of the North Stars that I had identified as guiding the work of the European Commission in the past 5 years. But there have been others. So there have been cases, for example, I go back to 2021, the update of the EU industrial policy. It's a communication in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. Updates a year after the original communication of the industrial strategy of the first von der Leyen Commission. In that communication, you find references to sustainable competitiveness, and in the same document also to competitive sustainability. And you know that, looking into the official documents, and you find out that actually the two have different definitions given by the European Commission. And then you ask yourself, which one is true? Which one is false? Then towards the end of the von der Leyen mandate, we were given a different answer that solves the problem. This is simply competitiveness, right? It's forget about everything else. And then it's up to us, the reflection. To some extent, the Draghi report leaves this open, but gives some indications. We were discussing this with Enrico before. But it's not clear at the moment what is the specific blend of competitiveness, economic security, strategic autonomy, resilience, sustainability, that will be the actual compass. And obviously, this is a name that I'm not bringing in just randomly for the European Commission going forward, right? And I want to just say only two things about this. So first of all is, obviously, we're all waiting for the competitiveness compass to be adopted by the European Commission, saying that this is going to be the economic doctrine of the Commission for the coming 5 years. It's a bit delayed due to the health problems, the pneumonia that Ursula von der Leyen has had. So it's probably something that's going to be released in the next couple of weeks. And we might have a first, and it's by no means the last word, but first indication of what blend of different policy goals and ambitions is going to be adopted by the Commission going forward. And the second thing is what I was sharing with some of the speakers a few minutes ago, and it's something that I also repeated in several talks and papers, including in a talk that I gave in DG Research and JRC in Champ de Mars this morning, sharing it with policymakers. From people like us that study public policy, none of this, competitiveness, security, resilience, and so on and so forth, is the ultimate policy goal that should be pursued, meaning the final goal of policymakers. This is something that we get from the EU treaties. I suspect that Enrico will remind us. It is something that you go back to Jeremy Bentham, you already know that. I mean, the ultimate goal for a policymaker is well-being. You can then translate that in the form of objective or subjective measurements. Different countries and different scholars have taken different approaches. You can also take this as a more, let's say, self-reported basis or a more objective form of measurement of well-being. All the rest that we talk about on a daily basis are the intermediate goals, right? What is going to get us to what is the ultimate goal for us policymakers. This is, I think, at least what we at CEP have been advocating. At least I have done quite a lot of work on that in my papers. And the competitive sustainability part is actually the driver, at least of part of what's hopefully going to get us one day to this more reassuring shores than the ones we are navigating in today. That's why I think by bringing together the work on well-being indicators and sustainability indicators from the JRC, from Enrico and Jessica, that will be presented now and that will be discussed also with the help of our speakers online and in the room. And the work on the Competitive Sustainability Index, which it can actually touch base today on what is out there in the perimeter of analysis that can give us an idea of two things. First of all, how complex and articulated the problem is. We cannot just look at competitiveness in Washington consensus style, or like minimizing costs and reducing red tape, sort of the less is more era, which is largely 20, 25 years ago. At the same time, we need an operational way, an actionable way to navigate through these difficult waters by keeping the richness of our policy goals and still have really the right incentives and the right coherence and consistency for policymakers as we move on. So let's get started. And we haven't, of course, fixed the technical problems, but we'll see this when they come. It's indeed what policymakers have to do, although they have to be prepared as much as possible for shocks. Let's see if we have been prepared enough. I think we get started today with a presentation by Enrico Giovannini and Jessica Cariboni. They tell us what they have been doing. It's just really unprecedented work. We're super happy that they came to see us and present this work. And then I will ask our Livio, Robert, Rutger, and Sandrine to comment on this, and we open up the floor to Q&A. So without further ado, and Enrico and Jessica, the floor is yours. I can give you the microphone, and Jessica, you got the clicker, so we are well equipped.
Good afternoon to everybody. Thank you very much, Andrea, and thank to CEPS for hosting this crowded meeting, and we are very pleased that this session this afternoon stimulated so much interest. What you will see later from Jessica Cariboni, who is leading the team in JRC with Peter Bengtel and others who have been working on these issues over the last 2 years. But my presentation will not be about the methodology and the results, but just to explain why I think what we have been doing is so important. Let me take you to 1836. Don't worry, I'm not going to in 1836, Melchiorre Gioia, an Italian economist, statistician, philosopher, published The Philosophy of Statistics, the first textbook, if you wish, about what statistics should be measuring and how. By the way, there is a fantastic place on the 12 indicators of ignorance of a population, which is quite relevant also for today, because the first one was the number of wrong facts quoted by politicians when they speak, and wrong facts quoted by judges and so on, and also the
But
percentage.
don't worry, we're not even going to check them anymore. So
Exactly, and also the percentage of people putting money on lotteries. But anyway, in that book, he tried to figure out what kind of domains should statistics cover. And you know that the original word statistics is science of the state, Staat, state of things, but also state with a capital S. And he said, okay, first of all, statistics has to deal with environment. He was saying agriculture in a sense, but anyway, because it's where we live. Then we should focus on people, demography. Then what people do to live, which means economy and economic activities. And what people do when do not work. So social statistics, if you wish. Then what the government does to support this process. And finally, the end result, poverty and happiness. 1836. I started from here because it's clear that we human beings measure what matters to us, and we pay attention to what we measure. So there is a clear political dimension in the statistical data that we produce, because they represent our way of reading the reality and also fixing objectives, targets, and so on and so forth. And if you wish, the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development is the highest level of coherent agreement, let's say, on how our future should be. The point is that in 1944, the US, you see, I'm progressing very quickly. The 1944, the US government called the British economists and the American economists, Mead-Stone from UK, and Kuznets and his team from US, they were locked in a room until they came up with um, the choice, because the two schools had different views on what should be measured to compile GDP statistics. And the US government, the Department of Commerce, went for the British solution based on the amount of production instead of the American solution, Kuznets' solution, who is normally quoted in textbooks as the father of GDP. He was not even invited to the second meeting because he was the loser. So don't trust too much economists when they write textbooks. Who was proposing a focus on well-being and consumption. Why did the US government go for the British solution? Because their political objective was to demonstrate that capitalism was able to produce more stuff than communism, period. That was the very simple objective that they had in mind. If you want to know more, there is a great book, The Power of Single Number, that describes this story. And the GDP is still being used, although, of course, it now includes many other elements. But at the end of the day, we still value the importance of different countries and the power based on how much they produce. And the American idea was to impose to the rest of the world this metric through the Bretton Woods institutions. And this is what happened. And in fact, the communist countries were using a completely different accounting framework. What I'm trying to describe very quickly is that if we choose one particular yardstick and then metrics and so on, we shouldn't forget that there is a political idea behind that. If we compare ourselves with someone who has chosen the metric, in a sense, we accept his or her power of deciding how I should be evaluated. This is a highly political point. Maybe you have seen, from 1944, I arrive immediately to the reality, an article by Martin Wolf on the Financial Times, not very, saying after the Draghi's government, the great US is great in blah, 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 productivity and so on. But if we look at health issues, inequalities and so on, I wouldn't like to, to live in the United States. This is the dilemma that we have today, which doesn't mean we change the yardstick because we don't look very good in that. That was one of the criticism to President Sarkozy when he launched the Stiglitz Commission, where I was the chief statistician of the OECD at the time. So this is not the point. The point is that the Article 3 of the treaty, we will see it later, which is the North Star of the European Union because it describes the aims of the Union, which is well-being, peace, and the protection of European culture, plus all the 17 Sustainable Development Goals in a way or the other, should be what we use to evaluate whether we are progressing or worsening and so on. And we should try to compare Europe and other countries according to a common yardstick, but not only the GDP. I've been part of this discussion on beyond GDP over the last 25 years, and a lot of work has been done around the world, and also the most recent OECD forum in Rome, the 20th anniversary forum that's on the measurement of well-being after the first one that I organized in Palermo in 2004. Now, a lot of research has been done on these issues, including projects financed by the European Commission, the MERGE project, the WISE project, and so on. And just to conclude, the overall research work decided to go for this definition of sustainable and inclusive well-being, which summarize much better than sustainable prosperity or whatever you want to use, which has been widely used by many research projects and institutions, what we want to achieve. And you will see together there is today the result of a 2-year project that JRC has developed after developing the framework for measuring resilience and other things that have been embedded in the European policies to show that it's feasible to have a different approach. You will see the data. You will see the data for the European Union, but the data concern all European countries. It's been really an incredible journey, and we are very pleased to present it today here, where, by the way, we had discussed last time also the new Stability and Growth Pact with the inclusion of resilience, which happened in some way. So we hope that in the same way that happened last time, this project will really design policies for the European Union, and not only because, and I stop here, the General Assembly of the UN in September, in the context of the Pact for the Future, agreed finally to launch an initiative to go beyond GDP. And we believe that Europe should be at the forefront, should be leading this world discussion in order to go, let's say, beyond what has been decided many years ago. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Enrico. We move now to Jessica's presentation of the substantive part. I don't know if the slides can be shown on screen. This would be useful. They appear on screen now. Okay, they don't appear on the other screen, but at least they appear on this one.
It works? Okay. Okay. So
yeah,
it's good that I took some prints out of my slides because I'm not able.
You're not able to okay. Look there. Today is not technically. Perhaps in terms of technical communication, we should also warn the participants that basically we're redoing the experiment in 1944. So you're locked in the room until we find an alternative, right? So I don't know if you had plans for the evening, but Jessica,
Okay,
over to you.
Let me thank you, Andrea, and thank you, Enrico, for having us here, for your introduction. And I also would like to thank the other panelists that will discuss with us what we have done in these last 2 years. I'm here to talk about what sustainable and inclusive well-being is and what we have done in the Commission in a sort of participatory approach with other parts of the Commission. And we believe and we hope that this concept will be a sort of North Star, actually, for the work of the new Commission. And Enrico, in the next slide, please. Enrico already stressed, and also you, Andrea, already stressed several aspects of the current political context, how things constantly change, especially in the geopolitical situation, but also the crisis that we are living, our society is living every day, and also the transition that we need to face. And we believe there is a strong call and actually a strong need to be able to navigate these times, I would say, the European way. And what the European way means is to continue deliver outstanding outcome in terms of governance, health, education, environmental protection, and so on. And we are not alone in saying this. I mean, maybe it was it went in between the lines, but this was part of the Draghi report, where in our view was clear that competitiveness should not be an end in itself, but should be there to ensure that these outstanding outcomes will continue to be delivered, and meaning that we will have well-being for current generation and for future generation as well. In the next slide, this brings me to the question, how can we measure what really matters? How can we put this up? I mean, it's clear, I don't have to repeat that narrow economic measures don't do a great job on their own. And I mean, if we take into account aspects of well-being, there is divergence. And Enrico mentioned there are still ongoing efforts in the OECD, and the UN has several streams of work. Here, I would like to show the results of an interesting paper that we found produced by the UK Office on National Statistics, where they have produced a new welfare measure. They call it gross inclusive income, and basically this can be used to produce a sort of productivity measures that take into account non-market production, but also the cost of environmental degradation. And you can see here in this graph that there is divergence respect to traditional measure of productivity. We found this approach very interesting because it's based on sort of monetary kind of assessment, and we believe if data allowed, it could be interesting to develop this also for the US and its member state. Actually, in the next slides, you will see that we have started to work in a sort of similar direction in the Commission under the umbrella of strategic foresight. In fact, in the 2023 foresight report, we put forward the idea to launch a new work to develop welfare metrics, complementing GDP and going beyond it. And the sort of agreed approach pointed exactly to look to sustainable and inclusive well-being. And we define it, and I will go back later on it, on the well-being of all people of current and future generation and of the planet. So putting emphasis on intergenerational fairness as well on strong aspects of sustainability. We have also launched an inter-service working group within the Commission after the Foresight report to agree together, discuss together with other services what do we mean by sustainable and inclusive well-being and how we can actually measure it. And this was the most important part of our job, but we also tried to start developing some adjusted GDP metrics in the light, in a similar spirit of what the UK has done, to try to have also something monetized, because we believe that this brings in some additional information. In the next slide, you see very quickly some results of these adjusted income metrics. The Foresight report in 2023 presented a pilot exercise on an health-adjusted income. What I found interesting here is that our approach looks at the EU as a whole, but it compares with US, China, and India today, meaning data as of 2020, but also projected into the future. And I think this is very interesting from in terms of the geopolitical situation that we live into. We see that when we take these measures into account, the EU does better than the US, as Enrico was pointing to. This adjustment by 2040 will be higher in Europe than in the US, and will give additional about 0.2% additional growth for the EU. Also, interestingly, if you develop this approach for the member state, we see that this adjustment amplify income differences across member states. And this gives a bit of power and interesting results of this monetized measure. We are also currently working on an inequality adjustment. This is the second piece, again, with this global perspective and looking into the future. And you see in the right graph, Europe is the second line, is the blue line that picks up and reaches the US with this adjustment by 2060, because inequality is projected to deteriorate a lot in the US. This is just a sort of a brief introduction to this measure. I found this very interesting. Peter Bencher is leading, and he's here in the first row. If you want to talk about monetized metric, he is the expert. Let's move back to sustainable and inclusive well-being, what it is and how we measure it in a different kind of manner, so with an indicator kind of approach. As I was mentioning, sustainable and inclusive well-being, as IWB in short, is defined. We have sort of agreed in the working group to define it as the well-being of all people and of current and future generation and of the planet. We have developed a conceptual framework to describe it and then try to operationalize it in a measurement framework that you see here in this slide. And the slides shows the balance that we need between well-being today and well-being tomorrow, well-being of future generation, and in between what we need to guarantee that there is this transmission of well-being from now to the future. In terms of measurement, the well-being today includes some monetary and non-monetary aspects of quality of life. It includes subjective well-being and many subcomponents. And in order to be able to transfer this well-being, we need, first of all, resources for the future. And we take here the capital approach by the OECD. So we look at economic capital, human capital, and social capital. But we also need resilience against shock, against crisis. And in particular here, we focus on socioeconomic resilience, digitalization, geopolitical kind of resilience, which is picking up more and more, and also some demographic challenges, because all of these can clearly jeopardize our sustainable path toward delivering well-being in the future. A very important part is nature. I was saying that we take a bit of a strong sustainability perspective where society is embedded in nature. We take into account, of course, natural capital, so the status of ecosystem services, but also how society interacts with nature. So, for instance, climate change, the sustainable use of resources, or some policies that, green policies that we are putting on the table. Inclusiveness is clearly one component that we have in our framework. We consider horizontal and vertical inequalities, but also try to factor in spillover of EU activities abroad, which is something rather new in the framework of this type. And last but not least, of course, we take into account the quality of institution as central to ensure the transmission of well-being. So, I mean, this is the conceptual framework and the monitoring framework where we try to put a bit of order. We have clearly tried to populate these with indicators, and we have done it in a very consultative manner. Our first step was actually to try to understand, do we really need a new indicator framework? Or, yes, thank you, or what's around? So we took many of the framework that the Commission used. We started with more than 1,100 indicators, and we mapped them back to our measurement framework. And we see that actually none of them does a good job, let's say, in a balanced way, independently on the number of indicators. And many of these frameworks are actually very sectorial. So we decided, let's try to do it ourselves, and let's try to work with other parts of the Commission to populate this framework in a balanced way and see where we get. So in the next slide, you see that we did it with several iterative process. We launched the consultation, and we narrowed down step by step these more than 1,000 indicators down to 140 indicators with a number of criteria, of course, data quality, relevance, but also this fact that we wanted to have something balanced, covering all our components that I have shown. We came to this extended dashboard of 140 indicators, and then we pushed a bit our colleagues to discuss further, and we came up with a summary dashboard of 50 indicators on which we have also calculated synthetic indices that we will show in the next slide. I mean, we believe that, this gives a really holistic kind of perspective, and this is why we believe it could become an instrument to move towards the North Star in the way that brings all these components together and can assess the effects of different policies that the Commission will put forward and implement. In the next slide, I'm going to show you some results. Yes, exactly. You see the various, the first row is the GDP per capita, for which we have ranked the countries, and then it comes the overall sustainable and inclusive well-being index and its component. I don't have the time to enter into how the color coding works, but just to explain that this is a relative ranking in percentile terms. So to make it easy, we take we develop and we build a reference distribution where we pull together all countries, all years, and then we see the position of each country in the latest available year where it falls, and this gives a percentile rank, and then we do the color coding based on this percentile rank. So red, orange is at the bottom of this reference distribution, while the blue, light blue, is at the top, and so it's the best performing in relative terms. So what we can see is that our overall synthetic well-being index varies clearly across the member states. We have a northwest southeast divide, as we expect. So, for instance, the best country are Sweden, Luxembourg, Denmark, Ireland, always in relative terms, but there are some exceptions also on the left part of the carpet. In fact, we see a correlation between SIWB and GDP per capita, but we also see some decoupling. One example I can pinpoint is Estonia. These lines in the orange part in terms of GDP per capita, but we can see some light blue in terms of well-being today, but also nature and institutions. So there are examples of decoupling, meaning that GDP per capita alone is not enough to describe sustainable and inclusive well-being for sure. In the next slide, yes, I show that there are some trade-offs, and actually the framework can be used to detect such trade-off across components. Of course, as one can expect, we have GDP per capita versus nature, where we see that there is a relevant trade-off, and the state of nature can be vastly different from the level of GDP. There are also exceptions here, and so competitive economies that can deliver also on the sustainability and nature side. I can pinpoint Ireland, Sweden, Austria, but others also at the bottom of the distribution in terms of GDP per capita are doing a good job. What I find even more interesting is the graph on the right, the pyramid of the right, that shows well-being today with respect to resources for the future. These are two components of our framework that more or less look at the short-term versus the long-term kind of objective that a country has. And you see again that here there are relevant trade-off, meaning that we may have good well-being today, but if we are not piling up resources for the future, this may become, in the long run, not really nice for next and future generation. So this kind of tool can also help seeing this kind of trade-off and how we should adjust our short-term versus long-term priorities. And last but not least, the next graph is about the evolution of our components over time. Here I am focusing on the GDP, well-being today, and the total sustainable and inclusive well-being. And we see that in general, there is an upward trend of sustainable and inclusive well-being. This is the red dashed line until COVID, and then it becomes flat, and then it starts decreasing after 2020, and this decrease in our indicator is driven mostly by consumption footprint per capita, which is deteriorating, but also the impact of social transfer on poverty reduction, which is a bit not functioning as it used to do, and for sure also by the governance index that we make use to describe our institutional quality. So there is a mixture of reasons why we have this trend down of sustainable and inclusive well-being that we do not see instead, for instance, in the well-being today that is really increasing a lot. This is the black line that picks up. And what is interesting is that in percentile term, the increase of SIWB and of well-being today is actually much higher than the increase between 2011 and 2022 of GDP. And we believe that this is also something interesting to notice. My last graph is about the evolution of the subcomponents. Here it becomes a bit difficult, the reading becomes a bit difficult, but we see, as I was mentioning, a deterioration of the quality of institution, and we see also some ups and downs in some components because there is a bit of heterogeneity in the underlying indicators which bring things up and down, but certainly going into the details of the indicator, we can a bit show what are the drivers of this situation. I think my time is over. We want to continue to work on many of these aspects, especially extending to the US, as we were mentioning, continuing our welfare measure, but especially continuing to engage with the stakeholders, with other institutions, because we really believe that we need to converge to agree on what matters and how we should measure it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Enrico, you want to add super quickly something, because then I go to
Just
our
one
panelists.
sentence. I don't know if you had the opportunity in your life to try to estimate GDP. I did it my first job was to estimate quarterly GDP. Once you do it, you can estimate quarterly whatever you wish. But the point is that we normally forget that GDP does not exist in nature. So it is a statistical construct. 70 years of investments on how to improve that particular measure, an incredible amount of research and data. This exercise shows that we have a lot of other data that we could use today. And I think that Europe also from this point of view, thanks to the work of Eurostat and other institutions, is really at the forefront also in terms of availability of data.
Thank you very much, Enrico. It is possible. So we are now in our panel conversation. We start our panel discussion. Will it happen? And what can we do? What do we want it to happen? And what can we do to make it happen? Let's see from the policy-making perspective and from, let's say, the analyst's perspective, what's the future, let's say, scenarios look like. So I'll start with Livio Stirbat. Livio is the head of unit of Industry 5.0 and AI in Science in DG Research and Innovation. Livio, do you think it will happen?
Hello. Yep. Many thanks for the opportunity to be here. It's great to be in such a setting with the openness and the foresight. We are thinking ahead, as the banner tells us. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I come from the Research and Innovation Department of the European Commission that manages the funding instrument, Horizon Europe, which is the world's largest. And in particular, my directorate is called Prosperity, which we're very proud of because it really goes beyond the more myopic versions of progress that we can think of, especially in this context. And we've been active partners with a lot of people in the audience and also on the panel in improving the EU policy framework for all the excellent work that has been done. And we, of course, are a department like the Joint Research Center that Jessica represents today. Andrea mentioned the competitiveness compass. It hasn't been postponed. It's now scheduled for the 29th of January, so rather soon. And in the context of this compass, competitiveness is not simply about outperforming others in a global race. It's not only about productivity and GDP growth or export performance. Instead, it's about fostering sustainable, innovative, resilient economic activities and an environment that benefits all European citizens. So that's the sort of, not North Star, but more the compass north for it. And the true north also moves, by the way, but at much longer cycles than the ones that we think about. Andrea mentioned that the team that I lead is called Industry 5.0. I'll mention a bit about that as well at the micro level compared to the macro level at which we talk about GDP. But I also work on applications of artificial intelligence in science. Statistics is one of these areas, and we're really excited about the possibilities that this kind of foresight and nowcasting and backcasting are afforded by this new revolutionary technology. But I wanted also to mention this morning, you spoke to my colleagues. I was in a panel discussion on artificial intelligence where a sort of constant reminder or on everyone's minds was the competition with the US, and especially the recent, very recent news that the Biden administration imposed export controls on chips for Europe. So these are things that remind us that our own well-being is not always in our own hands. And I think this is sort of a reminder of things that need to be brought in, and the colleagues in the GRC looked at resilience, expanded GDP, and yeah, it's a reality that needs to be reflected. We have, as a European Union, a democratic institution, we have to speed up the sustainability transitions to which we have already committed. We will have also, after the competitiveness compass, a clean industrial deal, really trying to catch up in a meaningful way and in a sustainable way on some of the competitiveness ground that we have lost. And our role in the department has been to fund such research, and you've heard some of the projects. You will hear also from one of them on screen today that would inform policy decisions. So that's our main function, and there's several of these projects that have been funded: Merge, To Be, Wise Horizons, SPES, Real, Wiser, all of them aimed at enhancing our capacity as policymakers to integrate well-being into our governance. We've also pioneered ourselves as bureaucrats from the research department, but those from the economic and finance department, a transitions performance index, talking about the sustainability transitions that I mentioned before. We've also funded some studies working with the community, as I mentioned, and in that effort, we've been sort of mirroring the work of our colleagues from the Joint Research Center. They've been drilling down from the hundreds of indicators. We've been drilling up from GDP, and we've now settled, we're now like really trying to give a bit of a reality check and feasibility of something like GDP plus 1, GDP plus 2, GDP plus 3 is something that we've shown the usefulness of with a rather recent study that we procured. And we've been trying to test this GDP plus 3 really in the European semester. So really trying to make sure that one of the most powerful policy instruments that we have at the EU level is fit for and useful in that setting, really building on the power of a single number that Professor Giovannini also mentioned. We have looked at the way the European semester looks at these indicators, and we found that many of them are hidden in annexes or footnotes, and they need to be given much more prominence, and also the interplay between them needs to be better analyzed. So, for instance, look at economic growth is not at the expense of environmental degradation. I mentioned Industry 5.0. That is a concept that has been given a lot of support by Andrea and a lot of the other prominent thinkers that are also in the room today or on the screen. And that is a sort of micro-level equivalent to this work, looking at sustainability, resilience, and human centricity in industry. So again, a similar attempt to go beyond a single metric by capturing the complexity and importance of stimulating real progress, not just sort of myopically. And as I said, together with our colleagues in the Joint Research Center, we started to work on developing use cases, further use cases of the Beyond GDP framework in the overall policy that the European Union does, beyond just the semester, which is a sort of flagship. And in this, we're working with other departments to work on green GDP or monetizing ecosystem services with our colleagues in the environment department. So for us, it's really an opportunity to support the work that that has been carried out, to give it more visibility, and to really bring it to the heart of policy making, so that we can jointly address the big challenges that we face. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Livio. And indeed, as a side remark, as I go to Robert in a second, there are a couple of missing bits there where DG Research and Innovation has tried to push, but that haven't seen full materialization and a former commission. And Enrico's been following that as well. I remember discussions years ago with Enrico as to whether there should be two, since there are 2 semesters, why don't we use one for the longer term and another one more for the country-specific recommendations and the shorter-term implementations. Never happened, but when in 2019, the first von der Leyen Commission kicked off, the first announcements were going in the direction of mainstreaming the SDGs in the semester, as Commissioner Gentiloni at the time was very keen on doing this, and at the same time in the better regulation agenda, because if you can see, if you do have a North Star, why do your policies dance on a different drummer? Why do your policy dance on an American drummer, like cost-benefit analysis, and then your actual long-term goals go in a different direction? That's actually a more than cognitive dissonance. I don't know if you've experienced that when you were Director General, Robert, and how you see this now from an enlightened external observer perspective. You can choose which personality you want to take now in your answer. You can also split. You know, we can take anything from you, Robert. But definitely, how do you see this? Do you think this time that we have the roster, potential indicators, and the work has been done, this can actually happen?
So I'm a recovering bureaucrat. So it is working, and so I'll try to speak to my better self rather than the past. The first thing I'd like to say is that in listening to these presentations in this room. Is this better? Yes. So I think the first thing I would say is that in this room we underestimate how much the two presentations represent unexpected good news for the rest of the world out there. The rest of the world out there is still saying, and perhaps not wrong in political terms, question, is von der Leyen to the retreat of sustainability, or is it a swinging pendulum? And I actually think that we begin to see evidence out there, but also in these presentations, that it's not that there is pushback, we're losing the green agenda, It's rather we are spiraling upwards. So I think that the fundamental good news is that without imposing any new reporting requirements on corporates, the JRC has produced something really important. So then, speaking to the question, I mean, let's say we're determined rather than optimistic or pessimistic, Andrea. The question is, what will it take to make it that this sort of indicator is what we hear on the 9 o'clock news and not GDP or the bond markets? Because until we get to the stage where commissioners and their cabinets know they need to know where this report is coming next, we're not winning. We're understanding ourselves better within the community of enlightened people, but we're not changing the run of play. And I think that therefore, rather than comment on the detail, I would like to make a couple of comments about how do you turn this into a motor part of the change agenda. And the first is we need to be sitting down, and there are some of us in the room, with representatives of and even really ordinary citizens. How does this apply to me? Because we need to validate the proposition that this more complicated way of looking at life is better. It more fits my reality. And there is, in the numbers, some sort of optimism about how well-being is increasing. On this, again, out there, there's a disconnect. Most people think the social contract is broken, budget austerity is coming back, I'm going to lose. How do we connect with the disquiet of citizens this sort of index? And then secondly, and probably two pillars are enough in this case, will corporate Europe get behind this? And we've seen very encouraging things, for example, the economics of mutuality around now spun off from Mars and becoming a thing in itself, enabling corporate actors to make their operating groups accountable, including getting their bonuses, for delivery not just on profits, but also on social and human and environmental capital creation or net impact in those spaces. How does that sort of very granular corporate accounting link back to this? And can we get to a stage where also the economic actors say, yeah, this makes sense for me? Because I think those are two missing pieces, let's say, in the change agenda. Within the detail itself, just to show I read it, I think one of the interesting pieces which comes up in some of the graphs is we have perception and reality. And we need to make sure through this focus grouping that the people who we want to support our work understand what's going on in the graphs. And the other point I wanted to make about the future of composite indicators is this. it has to be very easy to decompose it, because a lot of people think that composite indicators are a sort of shell game whereby, I mean, as we heard at the beginning, I'm losing on GDP, so I'll make it a more complicated indicator. We have to be able to always decompose. And again, if I quote the economics of mutuality game, and it was counterintuitive for me, the key breakthrough there in terms of corporate accountability is you get your bonuses not if overall your composite indicator is going in the right direction, but if you're doing both positive on profits and positive on environmental and human and social capital. So at some stage, we need to go from the big number down to smaller numbers, in a way as Jessica did in explaining some of the trends, that has to be very, very easy to do if we're going to make the shift from one big number to another big number.
Thank you, Robert. That's very important also for, how to actually implement this in policy. And it has to be easy to do, but without losing the richness of the concept itself. So no pressure, Jessica, but that's why there's quite a lot to do in that respect. The other thing is, how do we mainstream this into all the tools and the policies that EU institutions put in place? That it's very complicated. We've seen leaked documents, internal reflections on the European Competitiveness Fund, or the single national plans, conflating most of the existing instruments at the EU level and in the multi-level governance of the EU, so that they can be more coherent and consistent. But once you do this, you have to make sure that you get the conditionalities in line with the type of goals that you want to achieve in the medium to long run. And I'm not sure, again, that we are doing this, but to the extent to which this will be reflected in whatever we call competitiveness compass and all the other adjacent and other policies that will be implemented going forward, that will be very, very important. The compatibility of the competitive sustainability index with this would also be important. So the second panel that comes later, it actually would be good to see the extent to which you see a good fit in the work that we did on the North Star. Yeah, exactly. That's part of your mapping as well, and I understand. And in terms of our work on the North Star, when we, or specifically in this case, I myself put in the ultimate goals of the EU, the 4 capitals. Indeed, it's the more objective intergenerational idea. Well-being is something that is very compatible with what you have been doing, and then leads to a sort of a policy cycle approach within the European Commission, where you have what in technical terms we will call foresight in terms of long-term goals, and backcasting to set priorities today, so that you are relatively certain that by course correcting, by adapting to shocks, but you are navigating in that direction over the coming years. So we have 2 panelists online. For policymakers, we have always been, policymakers have been criticized because they never saw the crisis happen and they have to improvise. They are in denial until the crisis happens. This is what I've been done as moderator, because now it's the real moment of truth, because we're actually going to find out whether we can hear the panelists. And we have Rutger Hoekstra and Sandrine Dixon, who certainly have a fantastic addition to our conversation. So can I see if we can hear Rutger, or and
hello,
whether...
everybody.
Well,
Hello,
that's not too bad, actually. I'm
okay.
pretty relieved. So if this can happen, I think we can also... We can, don't stop, Rutger. We can also do this, right? We can also implement the indicators and the sustainable and inclusive well-being if we can manage to connect with Rutger. So Rutger, I give you the floor for your comments on our conversation, and thanks a lot for joining us online today.
Yeah, thanks a lot very much for the introduction, and also for the improvisation with the technology. Yeah, just a couple of comments. A real privilege to be able to, reflect on the report that Enrico, Jessica, Peter, and all the team have created. I think I want to just take a moment to also appreciate some of the key aspects that I really like. And some of them might seem a bit obvious, but I think they're important to stress. So first and foremost is this convergence towards this terminology that Enrico also reflected on. in my book that I published in 2019, you know, you could see 50 years of this kind of discussion, and all this terminology is actually a huge drag on really driving a message. So I think actually this convergence that is happening, not just from the JRC perspective, also OECD, a lot of the European projects that were mentioned earlier, UN level, there's a lot of convergence around sustainable inclusive well-being, sometimes called WISE. And I think that is actually quite an important step in becoming more effective. So that as a first start. Then I do think the work that we just saw needs to be commended on 3 conceptual points. Because I think they're quite unique in this sector. So first and foremost, the introduction of the resilience aspect to the dashboard, I think, is a really valuable addition to the sustainability part. Also, the fact that the capital approach has been, which is very much this resources perspective, has been linked also to the planetary boundaries perspective, I think is also very much commended. And also these international spillovers, I think is really a fruitful area also to really add also to these kind of initiatives. But I think what I want to focus on most is really, I think Enrico started the discussion really with the Kuznets stone. And I think Andrea also mentioned this means that, you know, we know the economy is a means to an end. And I guess we are converging towards this agreement that sustainable inclusive well-being is a good articulation of those ends. And in that sense, you know, Stone was very much looking at the means, at the production capacity, and Kuznets was very much towards the ends and the welfare. And I really think we should be focusing on systems that really look at both of those dimensions. It's not just about the ends without actually looking at the means. And I do believe that sometimes in this literature, you know, this broad literature that we've developed over the last 50 years, there is sometimes a bit of a lot over focus on the ends, but then not really an answer to how are those health services and economic development, how are they going to be actually created? And so actually, I do think this is quite a crucial aspect, that we need to work towards the means and ends in the compass. And in this framework that we just saw, I think there are, in the resilience and the future capital dimensions, a lot of the things that we would recognize also in the Draghi report. And I do also think that in the Draghi report, there's a lot of focus, I guess, more on the means. That he does mention, of course, a lot on the ends, but I do think the links between, you know, this compass and perhaps the competitiveness compass that will be created, it will be very interesting to explore. And to really operationalize that, I do think there's 2 aspects that from a scientific perspective also needs to be further developed. And the first is that, as Enrico mentioned, one of the core success factors of the system of national accounts was that it was also an accounting structure where trade-offs and, you know, relationships between economic stocks and flows were actually integrated. And the new system of national accounts, which will be published in a couple of months, does actually include some discussion of well-being and sustainability. So I think that could very much be linked to this work that is being done here at the JRC. But I do believe that what has been put down there is only the start of the research program that really is necessary from that perspective. And the project that I'm coordinating, Wise Horizons, is, for example, looking at, you know, what would a sustainable inclusive well-being accounting framework look like. And then the second dimension where I think also policymakers could benefit from a lot of this research capacity in all these projects, BEST, to be Wise Horizons, Merge, Wiser, is really the modeling aspects. I think GDP has a huge history of modeling, and I think you know, competitiveness will also be included more and more, of course, because of this agenda. But I think that does need to be linked with all of the modeling innovations that have been going on for the last 2 to 3 years in all of these research programs. Because policymakers, of course, don't just want to, when they're envisioning the future of the European Union, we really also want to know what things will be looking like going forward. And so I do think there's a huge opportunity also to advance the sustainable inclusive well-being agenda forward and also into policymakers' minds. Thank you. I hope that was all
this is great. Thank you very much, Rutger, also for broadening and reminding us of the roots of the conversation and what remains to be done to really complete the picture on the framework. And last but not least, we have Sandrine. We'll see if the audio trick works with Sandrine as well. Sandrine, of course, has been not only as co-president of the Club of Rome, but also with many other positions. In particular, has been for 4 years chair of the ESIR group of advisors within DG Research, so working a lot on not only well-being, but also sustainability, transition, systemic transformation, and Industry 5.0, among many, many other topics, has seen the substantive and the political dimension of this potential change in the way we measure progress. So I give you the floor, Sandrine, for your reflections, and thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, wonderful. And I'm sorry I can't be with you. I'm actually here at the College of Bruges giving a talk as now a new professor here to students about how we shift towards a well-being economy. So it couldn't be actually more helpful to have this conversation before I enter into the giving of this this class. But what I would love to do is build, first of all, thank you, Enrico and Jessica, on the incredible work that the JRC is doing, and also on the incredible work that Rutger is doing. I feel like we're all part of the community of change around how we move beyond GDP. Maybe what I can do, feeling that actually Rutger gave a perfect analysis of the strengths of what we're seeing coming out of this first initial steer from the JRC in terms of this report, is bring in a variety of different reflections based on the different hats that I wear. So one, working with Enrico on GDP plus 3 and the usefulness of GDP plus 3 and shifting more to a smaller quotient of understanding what we can focus on in terms of moving beyond GDP, and how can we start to land on the right indicators. Two, then, how do we test that, as was already indicated by Livio, within the EU semester? But then how do we actually build the narrative around that? And this is really what, for me, is so important. I think we need to get into the tactics. We now have all the incredible body of work from the JRC. We know that this is filtering into the work both of the OECD and also is going to have the possibility of filtering upwards into the work at the UN level. How, however, do we convince the president of the European Commission, knowing full well that through the work that we've been doing on narrative development with her, that there is a real need right now to both integrate the Draghi report and an understanding of what competitiveness means within the context of Europe, so value-based decision-making anchored in social and environmental pillars, very much anchored, as Enrico so rightly said, in our treaties and in our history, developing then that narrative that actually we can be competitive, not only as a European region, if we start to shift towards moving beyond GDP, but also if we develop our own way forward. And I think it's very important because we get so fixated on the Draghi report, but we forget to look at the Leyen report. And the Leyen report gives us so many more signals around how we can start to look at GDP indicators within the context of the single market, which we haven't done enough of. How can we start to really bring in Industry 5.0 and, for example, the system dynamic work that we did with Janusz Potocznik around developing a new compass, which very much looks at 50 nascent champions, which could actually fit within a beyond GDP spectrum. So the underlying, the underbelly of our economy, which by the way we know is pretty much small and medium-sized enterprises. What does that look like within the context of the beyond GDP indicators? And how do we start to develop the scenarios that actually enable us to show that we can remain competitive in our own way? Very much adopting this European pathway that actually is going to ensure that actually we develop in a very much well-being centric perspective. I think this does then call to question, exactly as Robert indicated, the fact that we keep on talking within our own bubbles. And now that we actually, first of all, it's a good thing we're at least talking to each other, because I think the biggest issue has been the ballooning of so many different narratives. We see it within the growth narrative or the no growth versus the well-being narrative. How do we actually first develop the right narrative for the work that we are actually doing together and ensure that we're working together in a similar goal? Is that GDP plus 3? Is that GDP plus 1? Is it ensuring that we have the right type of benchmarking and the right type of roadmap that actually is showing the different types of indicators? What is actually our pathway forward for all of us to use? And then how do we then develop that into specific scenarios that we can sell back upwards to President von der Leyen and then from Europe outwards as well? I think it's very important that we start to look at these tactics directly. The last point I would like to make is to very much bring in the fact that this obsession with the US and the Draghi report demonstrating the competitiveness within the US, but also the economic strength of the US, which we know is a complete fallacy. We need to unpack what is our true way forward versus that fallacy of infrastructure decay, of urban decay that we're seeing so clearly in the US. What are the underpinning economics that show that actually Europe can adopt this beyond GDP thinking through these indicators, and then the different scenarios that enable us to show what does that look like in 2030 and what does that look like in 2050 by also adopting the type of legislation and policies that we already have in place, but also what we need to do as we move forward. Two key other points. This is also about system thinking, and it's also about optimization and simplification. So it's not only showing a simplified gamut of indicators which could function, but it's also then showing how that translates into a new type of policy thinking, which is optimized so that we can actually enable moving forward, not only from an industrial competitiveness perspective, but also from a social well-being and environmental perspective, and really unpacking what that looks like. So either using foresight modeling or system dynamic modeling to enable us to do that, and starting to join the dots between all of them. So I guess that would be my first initial reflections. This thinking could not come, and this analysis, at a better time. I think all of us that actually were in Rome during the OECD meeting, and Enrico, myself, Rutger, Jessica, and others were there, felt very clearly as we woke up and saw that actually Trump had captured the US, that the only way out of the mess that we would be seeing is to still continue to move in this direction. So this pressure that we have as we try to find ourselves within Europe must actually be shown as a way forward to move into a well-being economy, which actually enables us to define ourselves differently and to look at social and environmental well-being at the same time, while the US implodes, which unfortunately it probably will.
Thank you.
And apologies for being so blunt, but as you know,
that's
I can
great.
always
That's great. Thank you, Sandrine.
say these things.
I will take 15 minutes between now and the end of the session. So I will give, of course, at the end, a possibility to our speakers to quickly react to what you've heard. But I want to open the floor to questions. If there are questions from the floor, we can take only a limited number. I will ask your help in being concise with the questions and possibly also with the answers. So we start here. Please introduce yourself. Then we go back to Celine. And okay, you need mine? Okay, can you take that one? Because otherwise it's going to be complicated. There's another one here. hiding here. Oh, over there, this gentleman here.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for the whole community, because I couldn't agree more with Céline just said, that this is the right time. I'm Antoine from the Institute for European Environmental Policy. Thank you so much for the invitations. We like to think that we're also part of this community of change, where we try to drive and foster and promote such concepts. We're actually having research right now that we look at how to foster such concept from a thematic perspective with finance, capital markets, indicators, policy, modeling as well, key part, and also in terms of justices. So hopefully being part of that movement. My question, I'm afraid, adds a layer of complexity to this whole easy question, these whole easy questions, and it builds on the analogy that we're using a lot today on the North Star. The fundamental feature of the North Star is that it's for the whole planet. And unfortunately, when looking at the EU, when we're looking at decoupling issues and so on, the growth of GDP, whereas decreasing environmental impact and so on, it can be very true domestically, but it's also very paralleled, and it shows in one of your slides actually, that it's also parallel with an increased external impact, detrimental external spillovers. And so and when we look at our impact from a global perspective, then I'm afraid the picture is more complicated. So in your work, Jessica, or others, how did you manage? It's notoriously difficult to get data and right instruments to actually account for these impacts. So if I can ask you, how did you, and whether did you manage to do so? Thank you.
Yeah, we collected that question, but this will give you, obviously, the opportunity, Enrico and Jessica, in the end, to talk about also what can happen at the UN level, and also how do you plan to expand the analysis beyond. So on the back, it's Céline. Céline, please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Céline Charveria. I work for Prototopia Consulting. Liviu was nice enough to mention the GDP press 3 paper that we authored. And in the paper, we have a recommendation of organizing an enhanced citizen assembly on this topic, because we feel that to make sure that there's a citizen demand for the North Star, we need to give them the opportunity to describe for themselves what Robert Kennedy would have said GDP does not measure, is what makes life worth living for. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Céline. Let me see if anybody else has questions or comments. There's 1 and 2. Please, I'm going to collect these 2. Then I will add perhaps a couple of points, and then I will go back to our speakers. Please.
Thank you very much. Laura Batchelor from Fit for Public Affairs. Thank you very much for a very interesting panel discussion. I had a question just about, I hear no reference to the work which was done in 2019 by the Finnish presidency on the economy of well-being. It seems to have sort of disappeared. I'd just be interested on commentary about sort of, obviously it's about, you know, this paradigm change, how do we make this the new reality? And that was quite a lot of substantive work. Obviously then COVID hit us pretty much after that, but I'd be interested in any perspectives on that work.
Thank you very much. I will warn the speakers that we'll go in reverse order so that we close with Jessica and Enrico. So Sandrine, get ready also, because then you have to go to class. And we take the final question, and then I will add a couple of points. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. My name is Clemens Rosmeier from the Austrian Federal Economic Chamber. I'm here representing the Austrian manufacturing industry. And I was wondering if the panel could comment on, I mean, we're hearing now I'm hearing a very nice academic debate. How do we translate this into policy? Because the companies still have to sell abroad their products. We still have very good products, but they're expensive on the world market. So how do these two combine? Do we do business as usual in policy and then just measure differently, or how does it combine? Thanks.
All right. So, yeah, I want to make a couple points to add to this discussion before I let the speakers then wrap up the conversation. The first is that I still think that there is a division and I'm going to be very telegraphic on this, but there's a division in the scientific community as to approaches that are somehow open-ended, like in the case of GDP or GDP plus 2 or GDP plus 3, where you actually tend to choose a metric and then the more the better, right? And what we call goal-based policymaking. I think the OECD, and in particular the Development Center, use that expression, and it's widely used in the literature, where you actually set a frontier, which could be something that a citizen assembly could also contribute towards, like asking yourself what kind of society you want to live in, what is the targets and the indicators by that time that you would like to achieve, like in the Sustainable Development Goals. And so operationalize this through a backcasting by knowing what the frontier is. And I think to some extent I've seen some frustration in the ongoing quest for finding an alternative metrics to GDP morphing into the idea of just let's decide what are the relevant pillars of a society we want to live in, and then pursue this in a form of multi-criteria or multidimensional analysis. So that's, I don't know which side you're on this regard, as if the speakers have comments. The second thing is, and this mostly for Enrico, but also anyone who has a view on this is welcome to express it. I think when the SDGs were presented and introduced for the first time in 2015, they were presented as integrated and indivisible, right? But when the von der Leyen Commission took office in 2019, be that because of specific political priorities or because of lack of competences on some of these aspects, absent a deepening in the semester of the SDGs through the Green Deal and other topics were actually divided, meaning the social dimensions, the institutions, the rule of law dimensions, many of the other dimensions, including some of the inequality dimensions, which largely fall in the hands of member states, are not super actionable at the EU level. And so I was wondering whether the fact that we had the territorial and the social tensions of the past months also depends on the fact that we had to, or whether we had to or not, we actually did divide the SDGs. Second reflection. And third is on the territorial dimension, meaning these set of indicators works, but the average measurement and the way in which EU policies fall on different portions of EU territory has proven to be very different. And so I was wondering whether you have ideas on how to incorporate that dimension, because otherwise we end up in the only perhaps relevant stream of literature that is not fully represented today, which is the one on the geography of discontent, where policymakers have actually looked into how even the twin transition can create pockets of large discontent that then are reflected and translate into fairly anti-European sentiment and being prone to listening to more populist and perhaps less fact-based narratives. So I go to you, Sandrine. This is just like sparse reflections. Please choose the questions that we received that you want to answer. I give you like short considerations, of course, because we are about to wrap up the sessions. But please take the floor now. Thank you very much.
Great, excellent questions. So the first thing is that to the question on the Finnish presidency economy of well-being, myself, I published a paper on well-being economics in the EU, anchored in the treaties, and also looking at the well-being economy, governments and countries. And one thing that we've noticed, and there are 5 of them, and there are more coming on board, by the way. Canada, if it doesn't become the 51st state of the United States, or the 52nd, if they take Greenland as well, actually has declared that it wants to become a well-being economy. Now, what's interesting here is that we can start to show what actually has worked in practice and what hasn't worked. So these are living examples of moving beyond GDP, but also the number one factor that comes up is exactly what Céline indicated, which is citizen engagement from the beginning is fundamental. So we cannot forget that, and we cannot continue to make this an academic exercise, which brings in then the question around industry. Absolutely, this has to be around how we can build and continue to build an industrial base in Europe. But we have to remember that we are also shifting out of basic industry. So what does that look like for the broader base of industry, including small and medium-sized enterprises? This is why I'm saying that we need to now make the link between the indicators and what that means in terms of scenario development and system dynamic modeling, which would enable us to see where are the social tensions, where is actually the well-being index, which we've started to unpack in our work at Earth for All. Last point, this is about Europe and the rest of the world. It's not just about Europe. So I fully agree with the first point from the IEP. We need to look at the spillover effects, but we also need to look at how can we develop different types of relationships with Africa, with Latin America, with Asia. This is the moment to actually reach out to China and start working in a very different way, also setting up different types of partnerships from an industrial perspective. So I actually think that moving in this direction enables us to open up brand new conversations, trade deals, partnerships with the rest of the world, and not actually creates an isolationist type of agenda.
Thank you very much, Sandrine, and good luck for your class. I go to Rutger for your comments.
Thank you.
Yeah, just briefly, I'll only really pick up on, I think, one of the points about how does this European perspective link to some global developments and our relationship with the rest of the world. I think Enrico also mentioned already that in the Pact for the Future, there will be a process by which there will be some harmonization internationally, and I think that will also have an influence definitely on the JRC reporting and the way that they frame that. So it's basically a process whereby the UN Secretary General is looking to go towards 10 to 15 indicators. I do think the new system of national accounts, which is going to be published in March, will be quite a shock to quite a few people. Because it does actually include in its second chapter well-being and sustainability. So I do believe that that will also be very much supporting this direction that has been taken. And one other thing I want to mention, especially in this international sphere, is that there has been quite a lot of development on what is called multi-regional input-output tables. And the IMF will be coming out with a global database of the world economy, also collaborating with Eurostat, and the database is called Mario. And that really enables the global economic structure to be modeled, but also to be linked to carbon, to critical raw materials, maybe also to be applied to CBAM modeling, so carbon border adjustment mechanisms. So I do think there's a lot in the pipeline that will enable us to get a far clearer picture of Europe and the rest of the world. One final thing I want to say just on what I found also quite interesting in the Draghi analysis was, of course, that basically without the tech sector, the US and European productivity were fairly similar or even equal. And so I do think we need to look at the tech sector specifically, also from a system, not just from the economic perspective and the productivity perspective, but I think increasingly we're also viewing the tech sector from the impact on well-being and institutions. And I think really we need to take that on board when developing technological advancements and innovations for Europe. Let's also take on board, the directionality of that, where that is going.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ruger. Well said. And I go to Robert for your final remarks.
So just to say for Jessica and her colleagues that I think the very important part that comes out for me on the follow-up is everybody else. So other countries, corporates, citizens. And to start with a show and tell, we don't need everybody's permission to begin, but I think it's polite to show and tell. And with citizens, that will help us to validate the meaningfulness of this composite model, without which nothing is going to happen. And for industry, I think there is a piece where industry says, okay, you're changing the metrics, what does it mean for me? And personally, I have quite clear answers to that. It doesn't mean business as usual with different metrics. And third countries will say, are you trying to justify your policy imperialism? And the answer is no, but let's look together at the collective impact, and the IMF tables will help us. But I do think that that's a very important step in socialization and in European thought leadership. And we need a bit more thought leadership at a time like this.
Absolutely. I go to Liviu and for some remarks, and then we go to Jessica. And
many thanks. Very briefly, to pick up on Robert's point about industry, indeed, not just business as usual, and we have a lot of unique selling points for European industry. I reply more from the micro level. I mentioned Industry 5.0. We have a community of practice with some of the biggest industrial players in Europe who are really doing walking the talk. And it's not just an academic exercise. It really has real life implications for the benefit of Europe, all of the things that we're talking about. And I wanted to close again to pick up on what was said before about the others, to point to something that I hope has not run out of steam, which is the Brussels effect. We've had it, we've shown leadership and the world has followed on privacy, on climate change, even on AI, safety and trustworthiness. And I think if we go that way, we have a good case for others to follow us as well. Not just because of policy imperialism. Thanks.
Thank you, Liviu. I go to Jessica, and then we go to Enrico.
Thank you. Very quickly, I mean, many of the question, if not all, has touched on things that are on our pipeline, and maybe Enrico can say a few things we just discussed before this panel. On the policy use, yes, I mean, the first thing that comes to people's mind is the European semester. We have experience with the European semester, with the resilience dashboard, and it is true, as Livio was saying, that sometimes this kind of indicators ends up in annexes. This is because it's a political choice. This is my experience. So the SDGs came out as the choice of von der Leyen in the previous commission. Now we have to see where this new college will go, if it will be broader, if it will be narrower, and now the one of next year seems to be already a bit narrower in terms of indicators. So it is really a political choice, but it's also true that if there is a political narrative behind that can be, you know, sold somehow to our political master, this makes our life easier, and this is why we believe the link with competitiveness is really, really important to be able then to put our framework at work. Peter is going to have a policy lab discussion on other potential applications of the framework in other political contexts, and we will be happy to follow up on this as well. Another comment that I've heard many of the discussants talking about modeling. I mean, this is the other side. It's not only about indicators, it's about models and how to bring into the models, including the one that we use in the European Commission, for instance, for output gap estimation. So it's long-term work to bring in, and we as JRC, we are doing it at research level to trying to include natural capital in the estimation of the output gap, but we need to really go step by step. So it's not only indicator, but it's also modeling, and it is also foresight. So we at the JRC are trying to bring all these angles together, the foresight, the economic and beyond economic modeling, and the indicators work, and we hope to do a good job in all this kind of perspectives. I would pass the floor to Enrico for some final remark from his side.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jesse.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all the comments and the questions. I think that some of them are already in the pipeline, as Jessica said, but others should push us to think more deeply. Let's suppose to have the best possible scenario after this seminar. So for a second, let's suppose that everybody agrees on this type of measurement. So what we would like to see by the end of the year, just to follow what Robert said, first of all, that SIWB is quoted in the State of the Union speech by Ursula von der Leyen in September. To do that, you have to build consensus, you have to test it, although GDP was never tested with people. But I mean, in Italy, we have done this exercise with the equitable and sustainable well-being indicators, and it worked in a sense, but we used intermediaries, such as members of the civil society, so the business associations. We used the National Economy and Labor Council, which is like our, at European level, the Economic and Social Committee. Well, that could be a good intermediary to try to get a feedback. You have to remember that, as I've been in these discussions for 25 years, I remember also the failures. You have to remember that Sarkozy, presenting the Stiglitz Commission, said, people feel that we are not doing well, while GDP is saying us that we are doing well. So the issue of reconciling what people feel and what data say is a problem. One way to go is, just to answer Robert's point, we have already drafted a possible press release based on this. As if we were asked tomorrow, okay, let me see how this would look like. It could be interesting to share this data that will be available on the JRC website uh, with country desks and see, do you recognize the country that you are following in terms of these indicators? So there are ways, if you wish, to continue this work. Technically speaking, the point is to have updated data. You saw the data to update it to 2022. It's not good, of course. We need to have almost real-time data. Okay. To do that, we have to do some evaluations, quarterly data for some of them. These are not peanuts, of course, not from a research point of view, but also from a communication point of view. One of the points that make GDP so important is that we have media quoting it at least 3 times per quarter, and so on and so forth. Interesting, the comment from Rutger show the flows and stocks, which is already, they are embedded in the conceptual scheme. Maybe we could present these. And the same could work in modeling, as also Jessica said. Again, 3 points I would like to make. For 25 years, we have been discussing about changing the SNA, about using composite indices and dashboards. Now, it looks like while we are driving cars with a lot of data, we become stupid when we think about statistics. We need a single number, while on our cars we are full of other indicators, if you wish. Presenting with some analogies some of these data vis-a-vis a car. So of course GDP is important. It's not something that we shouldn't look at. But if you end with no electric power or gasoline or whatever you wish, you have a problem. And the capital stock is exactly, the capital approach is exactly about this. Two last points. I do not enter into the issue of the European semester. Let me just remember to all of us that in the mission letters by Ursula von der Leyen, also this second commission, there is a clear reference to SDGs. So this is not going to replace SDGs, because that is about targets, it's about something that we are committed to. This is something that represents Article 3 objectives and to deliver to our citizens, not to the entire world, what we are committed to deliver. Last point. Rutger mentioned the new SNA, System of National Accounts, which quotes well-being and sustainability, and then says this is not able to answer these questions. Can provide important inputs, great, but is not going to answer. I think that is really the time has come for the European Union to do what the US did in 1944, creating a group to try to rebuild from scratch the SNA. Because we reached the limit of what the SNA can do. And we saw the experience of UK in this new concept of income and so on. I think that this would be also, together with this work, a good way for the European Union to sit at the table of the UN for the Beyond GDP discussion. And I like very much what has been said by, I think, few of the speakers, and in particular Sandrine, that this is a political process. And believe me, after 25 years, I can tell you that beside what the Finnish government has tried to do, there are parts of the world that are eager would be eager to go beyond the GDP because they have some strengths that are put aside in the overall discussion. So I think that this is a political problem, and you could gain support. I also have some countries in mind. And I stop here just with reference to what, again, Sandrine said, that this race with US. When I was chief statistician of the OECD in 2004, as I mentioned, we organized the first forum on well-being, and the chief economist launched the Going for Growth report that opened the discussion on the structural reforms. They decided to choose US as a model based on GDP per capita because US was growing. If they had looked at median GDP, they would have never chosen US. So what I mean here is that the targets that we choose really describes the type of world that we would like to build. Therefore, data are there. It's a political discussion, it's a political choice, but I think that just sticking to old measures is not good for European Union in this particular political context. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Enrico. We've wrapped up this session. I will ask everybody to give a big applause to our speakers and discussants. We will take a quick 10-minute break for coffee. And whatever you want to do, you have 10 minutes. But then we reconvene for the second very important part of the conversation. Bye to the speakers that are connected online. And thanks again to all of you for this very rich discussion. Coffee is downstairs.
Thank you.
Don't need to exit the building, please. Don't exit the building. Just stay within the building.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
ovviamente ci sono delle cose pratiche, ma è molto, cioè il fatto che ci sia questa convergenza verso un concetto, verso una ricetta che sia più o meno accettata, una singola ricetta accettata.
Abbiamo un punto di partenza solido
Sì,
per
no.
lavorare il corretto.
Forse non ci rendiamo conto di quanto fondamentale sia lo shift di cui stiamo parlando, perché
No, ma
non
ce ne
sono...
rendiamo talmente conto che gli Stati Uniti stanno facendo la guerra per tornare al vecchio sistema. Questa è la grande opportunità persa dall'Unione Europea con Biden, capito?
Okay. Can I invite everyone to sit down so that we can start the session? Let me take my notes. Hi, Heather. Wherever you want. David? So welcome back, everyone. I'm Chin Salcidi, and I'm extremely pleased to moderate this session. I won't make a very long introduction because we are late, so 15 minutes late. I'm still aiming at finishing on time, so I'll let you go at 5:15, let's say. So the topic of this session is, let me say, competitiveness, to keep it easy. And just to say that basically after debunking the concept of GDP, in this session we are going to debunk the concept of competitiveness. So two key concepts in orthodox economics. And I have to say that I'm an economist, and I grew up with orthodox economics, so the discussion we are having today, I think it was somehow unthinkable 10 years ago. Things have changed so fundamentally. I mean, I'm sure someone in this room will remember that around 2010, the concept of competitiveness was essentially an issue of the euro area, so relative concept, mostly measured for each member of the euro area relative to Germany, which was at that time the benchmark. So this is where we stand, and basically unit labor cost was the main indicator. I mean, this idea of competitiveness, macroeconomic competitiveness measured by unit labor cost has now changed a lot. Even in the Draghi report, this concept is not there anymore. Labor is actually considered as one of the drivers of competitiveness, not just a cost of an input, a factor of production, which represents a cost. So things have changed, but I think what we are going to discuss today goes much further, much beyond that. And the idea is really to put on the table a concept which is the one of competitive sustainability. So it's not, it's putting really at the center sustainability and how to make it competitive rather than putting in the center competitiveness and the dimension, additional dimension and aspects which are related to sustainability. And with this, and without further ado, I would like to invite Martin. I'm sorry, my voice is a bit down. So Martin Porter is the executive chair of the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. They've released just in December, if I'm not mistaken, the 2024 Competitive Sustainability Index. And the floor is yours for explaining us what it is and what you find.
Thank you. Does that work?
Yes.
Does that work? Yeah. Thank you, Cinzia, and thank you for the invitation, and I hope you're still here. Thank you to Andrea for having agreed to organize this event with us in a way which reflects two strands of work which were developed in parallel, but actually have converged in a very interesting way, I think, to come to, from different starting points, a set of ideas and conclusions which actually are very complementary. So I hope you will see that from what I go into in a second, how that is the case. But thank you to Andrea for the willingness to take a risk, if you want, on combining when we hadn't worked for a long time on the same topic. Although we do have points in common, and the JRC, I think, as you'll see, is one of those points in common.
I'm going to run through what Cinzia said was the December launch of the Competitive Sustainability Index. And my colleague, David Chembrero, will go into the key findings of it. And after that, we'll hear, I guess, a discussion about why we think this is relevant and useful for the current discussion, which is so much focused on competitiveness now. And I will also try to pick up on some of the points which were made by Enrico, Andrea, and others with respect to why measuring this type of aspect of competitiveness is so important, and being able to root our agreement on what we're measuring in order to be able to do it better and to then draw the right conclusions and develop policy in a better way. Why that is so important, and indeed to make sure we're all talking as far as possible about the same thing. And the starting point for me was to look at competitiveness in the context of the sustainability transition, inclusive or well-being and inclusive sustainability being part of that thinking, but not the only one. But in starting from what is competitiveness, how do we try to measure it and relate it to the sustainability transition, what's interesting is the technical dimension to our work reflects almost entirely, I would say, and very consistently, all the work that you've just heard about being developed looking at the broader concept of beyond GDP and how we should measure our economic development and progress more widely. So with that, I will jump up and hopefully be able to talk up here for a second. So a little bit of history. Enrico began with a little bit of a history lesson. Our starting point in this actually was the notion of competitive sustainability that the European Commission, and indeed the President in 2019, her team developed this as a way of their thinking being organized for the European semester. And it has been used as a term, and I think Andrea mentioned that in different Commission publications, you see it referenced, but you also see referenced sustainable competitiveness. So there isn't a consistent and applied approach to the use of this terminology or the thinking behind it thus far. But we took the idea that tried to look at the combination of environmental sustainability, social sustainability, economic sustainability, and governance sustainability. And the challenge that essentially was laid down to us at the time was, how do you measure this? How do you measure it in an integrated way that reflects what we're trying to achieve, rather than looking at this in silos? And I think, sadly, we can still see to some extent the debate about competitiveness is had in one silo, and the debate about sustainability often happens in a different silo. And we have to bring these things together and have a way of just talking about them and measuring them, which is more integrated. So our self-given challenge in a way was to try and come up with a version of measuring competitive sustainability. And what you see on the right-hand side here is essentially the compass that we ended up developing that reflects all of the thinking that tried to link those different indicators that were relevant to those four components together in a way which means that the economics of this remain absolutely fundamental, but we also capture all those other dimensions which were mentioned in the previous discussion. And as a result, we believe we have a version of competitive sustainability that is the first of its kind, that looks at competitiveness as a function of our ability to compete in a global economy and with a global society that is all challenged by environmental sustainability dilemmas and challenges, but also the social ones that were mentioned. And which therefore enables us to draw comparative performance conclusions for countries within the EU, which was the version we published in 2022, primarily focused obviously on the 27 EU member states. But now in the latest edition, we're also able to compare, in some ways, the international competitive set, so the US, China, and 10 other countries as well. And it's a first attempt to try to do this, of course, but one which we think, with the scrutiny that we've had from many organizations, many experts, many groups of people, and indeed the audit that the JRC have done, it works. I think it's robust. It's a measurement system that hangs together, we hope, well. And therefore, we believe it's also going to be relevant for what we know is going to be published in a week or 2 weeks' time, the competitiveness compass. and should help make the type of decisions about the trade-offs involved in addressing the short, medium, and long-term dilemmas of this transition made in a more explicit and better way, so that we don't end up trying to promote short-term competitive advantage at the expense of either social or long-term environmental damage, for example, or vice versa. So that essentially is the model that we have come up with from 4 years worth of work and published the latest edition of just before Christmas. We have taken the view that we need an explicit working definition of what we understand by competitiveness or competitive sustainability. And I think you will see from this working definition many of the lessons that the previous session showed needed to be drawn about how we try to incorporate factors that are relevant to innovation, relevant to orthodox views of economic competitiveness, but also planetary boundary conditions, for example, so environmental conditions that are necessary to include. And that, very importantly, we recognize that you have to talk about and measure competitiveness potentially differently at a macroeconomic level, so for whole countries, for sectors or economic innovation ecosystems, value chains, so a level down, and or for individual companies. Each of those will look at competitiveness in a slightly different way, and we have to find a system that enables us to talk about all of those or disaggregate as necessary. So that's our working definition, and you can see as well here, investment is a key component. This is obviously top of mind when we're talking about the clean industrial deal. Obviously the MFF and all of the policy challenges revolve around mobilizing necessary investment in the short term. So investment is clearly important as a component to this. And then lastly, I hope many of you have picked up the report, so I won't go through this into detail. But in the index that we have now, even though it's developed over 4 years, as I said, with all of the input and looking at all of the other indices that are relevant to competitiveness, sustainability, or innovation developed by the EU or internationally, the OECD, the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, we looked at all of those, and none of them yet integrates all of these components in a way which gives you an integrated view. And therefore, we hope we have combined all of the ways that they look at it, the indicators, the data being reliable, comparative across countries and so on, but also being able to measure what enables competitiveness as well as what the outcomes or outputs of competitiveness should be. So the means and end question, I think, that was raised before, and how we make sure that we're looking at innovation, which is often, and quite rightly, still referenced as key to the competitiveness challenge, but also move beyond the orthodox view of GDP as a function of competitiveness, so we're measuring these other things as well. And therefore we see resources and material footprint, for example, being very important in this too. So with that, we do have some findings, and I think we can briefly now turn to my colleague David, who will be able to run through those quickly. And then hopefully we can wrap up and conclude with policy conclusions and a discussion on the findings. So with that, let me pass over to my colleague David, who is the real expert and the brains behind this index. So,
thank you, Martin. Well, I'm going to briefly present the main findings from the Competitive Sustainability Index. So there, from left to right, you can see the results of the CSI in the 2024 edition, but also in the 2022 edition, and the changes between those two. And similarly, for the 4 dimensions that make up the index, namely the economy, society, governance, and environment dimension. So on the overall level, we haven't seen dramatic changes from 2022 to 2024, although the general trend is slightly downwards. However, if we step down one level and we have a closer look at the dimensional level, then we start seeing some differences. So for example, whereas in the governance dimension and in the environment dimensions, we've seen performance improve over the past 2 years,
in the economy dimension, and particularly in the social dimensions, we've seen the opposite trend, meaning that we've seen significant drops, particularly in the social dimension, and even within that, with that, the social dimension is still the one with the highest average performance, which clearly shows the strength of European social pillar. On the other hand, the dimension with the lowest average performance is the economy dimension. And we will see the main reason for that in the next slide. So one of the, I would say, novelties of this index is that for the economy dimension, and just for the economy dimension, we have an additional layer of analysis, which is the ecosystem level. So where we have a closer look at research and development and innovation performance on the 6 ecosystems that we believe are critical in order to achieve climate neutrality. So namely, energy, industry, mobility, buildings, land use and agri-food, and digital. And in order to build these ecosystems, we've implemented the EU taxonomy. So what we've done is we've looked at the taxonomy, we've taken all the economic activities listed there, we've grouped them within these ecosystems. And then we've checked the research and innovation performance on these economic activities. And so here you have the resulting picture, both in 2024 and 2022 at the bottom, and the change between those two. And the overall picture basically can be, I think it's clear by the color coding there that the overall performance is not great on these ecosystems. So in all cases, you can see that there are a majority of countries in orange and in red, which means that they are performing weakly on these indicators. But however, we can also see that there is a significant group of countries in all of the ecosystems in green and dark green, which means that they are also performing quite well. So this clearly shows a risk of having a two-speed Europe. So with a small group of countries leading the transition, whereas there's a bigger group of countries just lagging behind. In terms of performance by ecosystem, probably worth noting that the agri-food and the mobility ecosystems are the only ones in which we've seen performance improve over the past 2 years, whereas the biggest drops have been seen in the industry and the energy ecosystems. And in particular, industries, as a result of this worse performance, the ecosystem with the lowest average performance of all 6. On the other hand of the spectrum, the digital ecosystem is actually the one with the highest average performance, even though you can probably see there, no country managed to actually excel in terms of performance within this ecosystem, which is somehow consistent with the mid-technology trap described in Draghi's report. So in addition, or besides the main results from the index and the ecosystem pieces, we've also would like to present here today some of the insights that are based on some of the indicators that make up the index. So what you see here is basically a summary of the international benchmark conducted on the 24 indicators out of the 81 that make up the index, the 24 for which we have available data internationally, and more precisely for which we have data for China. Because what we've aimed to do with this exercise is basically see how the Europe performs against US and China. So the main conclusion, as you can see there in the green line, is that EU's best performer is usually also global best performer, whereas EU's worst performer is also usually global worst performer, which is, in a sense, I mean, it shows the uneven performance across the EU member states and makes the case for bringing closer these two ends, and meaning closing the gap between the top and bottom performance within the EU, and that would probably mean we would be more competitive against these two other countries. Here you can see other two indicators that make up the CSI. So on the one hand, we have the amount of money being deployed or spent on fossil fuel subsidies. And on the other hand, we have the amount of money being invested in developing the new generation technologies that will make a low carbon economy possible. So I think the graph speaks for itself, and it doesn't really match the political discourse in most of these cases. So maybe it was a reflection. Here we have another indicator that make up the index. In particular, we have a look at the venture capital investment so that we can have a clear overview of what the race to net zero looks like. And as you can see there, I'm afraid Europe is not leading the race. So we are lagging the US, in particularly when it comes to late stage venture capital. But the good news for Europe are twofold. So first, we are still within reach of the US, which is not the case in other digital fields, in other technological fields, sorry. And so a powerful clean industrial deal could probably reduce or close that gap. And secondly, as you can see in the blue line, we do have in Europe some real champions in venture capital when it comes to relative terms. So we do know what it needs to be done. We just need to follow our internal leaders. And then finally, this slide builds on the discussion that we've been having in the previous panel around the need to move beyond GDP. And if we agree that we need to move beyond GDP, I think we would also agree that we need to change our productivity metrics. And what I mean by that, or what we mean by that, is that we probably need to have at least incorporate new metrics to measure productivity to complete the picture. And what we see here is that's the analysis we've done, that's the exercise we've tried to do, and we've compared traditional productivity metrics such as labor productivity and GDP per capita with what we believe should be a key metric in a transition to a just, clean, and competitive economy, which is resource efficiency. And when you do that, you may end up with different conclusions. So for example, on the top graph, you can see that the US is leading the EU in terms of labor productivity, but it's also true that the EU's material footprint is actually half the one of the US and China, meaning that we are outcompeting them on that metric in absolute terms. If we go one step further and we have a look at the resource efficiency in relative to the size of the economy, meaning how much materials a country needs to produce all its goods and services, we then have a picture of resource productivity that may give some insights. So for example, even though under this metric, the US is still outcompeting the EU, is very closely behind, and the EU is outcompeting most of its international competitors. And if we have a look at EU champions and not just EU average, EU champions really outperforms the other international competitors with the exception of Switzerland, which is the absolute champion on this metric. And then finally, I would like to share with you this, which is not based on any specific indicator, but basically on the correlations between different elements of the Competitive Sustainability Index. So the structure we've used for the Competitive Sustainability Index allows to compare different parts of it. And in this case, we've compared the social, governance, and environmental input indicators with the economic outcome indicators in all three cases, with a two-year time lag between those two elements. And as you can see there, there is a clear positive correlation in all three cases, And of particular relevance is the one at the bottom, in which we can see that countries with higher level of environmental inputs in 2022 do also obtain higher level of economic outcomes 2 years on. And then my last comment would be that we've made all this data available so freely. So whenever you receive these slides, or you can search for it probably, there's an online dashboard where you can get all this data, play with the data, and do your own analysis. And I've also included there the link to the JRC audit, where you can find probably even more interesting data than what we have in our report. So with this, I'll pass over to Martin for, yeah.
Thank you, David. And following those findings, we tried to distill a number of broad long-term policy conclusions. We discussed with many others, obviously, in the process. But I think you can see them here, and I'll just very quickly talk to each of them. The first of them being that for the discussion on competitiveness, which is obviously happening in real time, as we know right now, it is essential we have a common reference point, a definition, a working method to assess it that we all share. And an invaluable contribution to that obviously could come from the European Commission. Many of us will have our views. We've offered a suggestion for competitive sustainability. Absent that, the risk is that we talk about different things when we're talking about competitiveness, and we don't get the right conclusions or set the right direction. So number one is let's try and be clear about what we're talking about at the right levels. I think the second, and this draws very much on Andrea's work on the North Star, is that there is an immediate crisis of competitiveness that people feel, that businesses feel, and that needs a response. There is a much more or equally important long-term strategy that if we can go back 20 years, clearly the Chinese thought about 20 years ago and are reaping some of the benefits of today. The EU must seize this moment to think strategically about 20 years hence. And the North Star that has been mentioned and the process to developing that, Andrea's paper actually sets out a really interesting method, if you want, for the EU to do that. So let's make sure that we get the long-term strategy, the compass, and all that goes with it, to mesh with the short-term response that we're obviously going through right now as well. So that's a second key conclusion. The third, and this is something that David highlighted as well, as we see that long-term shift in the nature of the economy, material and resource productivity is very likely to become a much greater function of our overall ability to compete internationally. We're not doing badly at the moment, but we know, given planetary boundary pressures, amongst other things, we are going to have to do much better, but we have a competitive advantage at the moment, and we see this from other figures in research and innovation, that shows the EU can exploit the position it's got to and do even better in due course. So if there's one area to emphasize, really drill down on circular economy and make that a key competitive advantage in due course. The fourth area, international partnerships, that talks in part to resilience and which is one of the components of the index as well. I think it also talks to what Enrico said. A key soft power, actually, for the EU is its ability to project a forward-thinking approach to trying to pull all of these things together, a way of measuring progress, the beyond GDP ideas, sustainable and inclusive well-being, but also a way of measuring competitiveness as a function of that. So this international partnership approach could extend to exactly what he was suggesting. We need to be talking about how to measure these things better internationally, not just in some countries or all countries of the European Union. So that would be the fourth point. And I think the last one, if I'm looking up at this now, I can't. Yes, and I think this links to other work that we're doing within CISL as well, and touches on what I think Robert Madeleine also mentioned. This needs to be relevant not just to policymakers, obviously, and to people like us. It needs to be relevant to individuals, but also to businesses, individual businesses. And individual businesses are often now challenged to think about how they compete in the short term, but how they are agents of change in this transition as well. So we're working on how to disaggregate the approach so that it applies to regional economies, but also to individual companies. And that's a way of assessing comparative performance, competitive performance between companies. But this needs to be an agenda which is embraced ultimately by those who haven't embraced the sustainability agenda, but just see the way that they can compete more effectively. So the wider business community. So that's a recommendation, I guess, to all of us, but anyone working in a business context, to look at this as the future of their competitive positioning and their competitive advantage per se. So those were the 5 conclusions we were able to draw from these findings. There are many others at levels of detail we don't have time to go into here. But thank you for listening to that, and we'll pass over to Cinzia for the discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Martin and David. I think it's quite interesting that there is really one common point between the 2 sessions, which is the complexification of the concept we are speaking about, and the fact that we are not just looking at production, whether this is in GDP or production relative to others' ability to produce when it comes to competitiveness, but really adding all the dimensions, the environment, society, and governance. Now, we have an excellent panel of speakers, and I would like to invite each of them to comment on it. I would like to start with Michaela Saisano. She is head of unit for science, for modeling, monitoring, and evaluation at the JRC. Martin mentioned several times that there was an audit by the JRC. I think this is quite crucial. Anyone could come up with indexes. I think it's crucial that there is scrutiny on how the index is built, whether it's sensible, especially if we want to promote the index for policy purpose. So I would like to give the floor to Michaela for comments.
Thank you, Cinzia. It's a great pleasure to be today, and thank you very much for hosting us. Let's see, I'll try to be there, but I'll go down. Yes. Actually, I didn't want to have anything standing between me and you, right? So, and as I don't have any paperwork, thank you. This way I find it closer. So in fact, Martin and his team asked us at the Joint Research Center, because we have over 25 years of expertise, statistically speaking, on what makes a good index. Now, as you have seen, there are many indices out there, many scoreboards capturing different phenomena. And so if somebody wants to have some trust and faith in them, at least from the statistical point of view, there should be some coherence. So I'll try to start a little bit with something that the Competitive Sustainability Index has been struggling at the beginning, saying, is there a way, to put together the European Green Deal and the competitiveness agenda of the EU, or is it a kind of a fight between the two? So in fact, the way that this index has been developed is somehow to be a window of opportunity, to show the interconnected opportunities between the different dimensions, the economy, the society, governance, and the environment one. And at the same time, really putting a lot of focus on the framework conditions, the impacts, and the outputs. You heard Rutger when he was saying, putting together in a framework the means and the ends, right? So in that way, this framework had exactly that nuance when it was developed. And of course, it also had elements that other monitoring frameworks around the EU do not do as such in the same package. So you have this focus on energy, industry, mobility, buildings, land use, and digital aspects, no? So in one big package, you have all those elements that are usually not found in other frameworks. I'll show you a little bit of statistics. It's gonna be very easy, and I promise it's not gonna be painful. When we looked at the 81 indicators, so the whole monitoring framework, and the way it has been combined into 31 components, 10 sub-dimensions, 4 dimensions, and 1 overall index, the natural question that emerges, but are these aspects working in synergy between them? Are there trade-offs? And are there any kind of components of this framework that somehow cross across different dimensions? And in fact, we found that there are these 9 ones: innovation readiness, jobs, education, inclusivity, fundamental rights, transparency, institutional efficacy, citizen engagement, and security and resilience to external shocks, that if you see these numbers, these are correlation coefficients, no? So the higher the number, it goes up to 1. The closer the two phenomena are, so the more they co-walk. Huh? I don't want to use statistical terms, but yes, that's the logic. And you do see that these cross, they are very important across the 3 key dimensions, the prosperity, fairness, and governance stability. So what does it mean from a policy perspective point of view is that these are the priority areas where if there is coordinated action across the EU on these key, it would impact many other aspects of what we're trying to measure. No? And it would definitely lift the whole EU, not the individual member states only. On the other hand, there are some key elements into this global phenomenon that somehow show weak correlations. The business fabric, entrepreneurial activity, resource use, and biodiversity. Now, what does it mean? For the first two, the more, if you wish, economy-related aspects, these could be some data issues, maybe the choice of the indicators. There must be something else. It's not that the team has not done its proper work. It's just that it's still thinking about how do we somehow affect those indicators. On the other hand, the story for the other two, the resource use and the biodiversity, is very different. No, because we do see that there must be something hidden underneath. And in fact, when you saw the graph that David showed you, and I will show it as well, there is a time lag issue. And it's also not accidental that the European Union has actually developed a dedicated framework on biodiversity, because that actually suggests that we need to focus on biodiversity on top of everything else. If you put it in any kind of monitoring framework, and this is one of them, very valid, but it's one of them, you'll see that biodiversity is always lost. It seems to be hidden. So even if we are progressing on competitive sustainability, on well-being, on other things, we are not doing that great on biodiversity. So we definitely need one extra eye on how biodiversity progresses. But that was a graph. I will go exactly to the graph that David showed you before. There is a time lag. So countries in the Euro, when we looked at when the team actually looked at the economy impacts in 24 edition and the environmental framework conditions in 2022, right? So what we get as an economy and what we invested initially, the enabling conditions for the environment, with a 2 years time lag, we see that this investment pays off. So that's also quite interesting to, as a graph. Is it coherent? Now, there is a full report that actually suggests that it is scientifically robust and coherent, and that all of the components of the index actually arrive up to the overall index level, except for the few that I mentioned at the beginning. We also tortured the numbers, because one of the usual critique that is applied to composite indicators or to any kind of aggregation is that, you know what, maybe it was a choice of how you decided with the weights, how you did the aggregation method, how you did all these other methodological and modeling assumptions. So we really tortured the numbers, and say torture them as much as possible within reasonable bounds, obviously, to look at whether these rankings actually are affected. And we did see that they are quite robust. There are some countries that are more sensitive to these assumptions, and therefore, for instance, Malta, Cyprus, and Slovenia, in some of the dimensions, jump quite a lot, and that is very important to know, because one of the key things that the team asked us is we want to be as transparent as possible and have everything out. No, so the other type of test that we did, as I said, we had to torture a lot the framework. So the other type of test that we did is to make sure that there is an added value when you look at the overall index. And so when you see how these countries are shifting across the different dimensions, there are notable shifts as well, which means that if you take the index on its own, you don't get the whole picture, but you also need to get the 4 dimensions and all the underlying components in their own merit. Does this index add any value to anything else that exists out there? And is it also, we were discussing the convergence. Rutger was saying, and also Enrico mentioned, that there seems to be more convergence of the different frameworks towards some, common common notions, of inclusion, sustainability, these kind of measures of societal progress. So we took the Global Innovation Index as our yardstick, the Global Attractiveness Index, the World Competitiveness Index, and the Global Talent Competitiveness Index, all of them capturing similar aspects of competitiveness at the international level, where the EU member states are included. And we try to see how this index and this framework relates to all of them. And what you see is, first of all, that the correlation is quite high on many of them, which means that there is a convergence, right? So it gets, if you wish, this kind of statistical validity that we are seeking for. But at the same time, when you look at the positions in the ranking, there are also notable shifts, which means that this framework is giving elements that we couldn't see with the other indices. So all these pieces of information are actually included in the report, so you can have what is needed. Because of its properties, we have also included the index in the Commission's, in the GRC Composite Indicators and Scoreboards Explorer. This is a tool that we have developed. It hosts practically all the Commission developed indices and scoreboards, those by the EU agencies and those by international organizations that are actually impacting the EU and the international agenda. And by doing that, you can have a lot of visualizations and graphs. The team has also developed a dedicated page where you can actually look at these numbers, but by including it in the Commission's Composite Indicators and Scoreboards Explorer, you can actually see that vis-a-vis other monitoring frameworks that are existing out there. So this is the tool that we have developed. As I said, it has about 200 now monitoring frameworks, 3 million data points behind them, and we have rearranged all those frameworks across the 6 new policy priority areas of the Commission and across the Sustainable Development Goals. So to conclude, the Competitive Sustainability Index has followed this systems thinking approach. It has required a delicate balance between the scientific rigor on one hand and the policy consensus on the other side. And save the date, not precise, save the month actually. On the second half of March 2025, we are organizing a big event in Brussels on how different composite indicators and scoreboards have impacted EU and international policy making. So thank you very much. I hope you now get a better understanding of how much torture has been to this index. Thank you.
So thanks very much, Michaela. And indeed, it looks like the framework was really tortured, but it survived. So I think it's a good sign. I would like now to move to the other 2 commentators. Maybe we move away from the technical aspects, unless you want to raise some points, but maybe also to discuss a bit what could be the policy use of this framework and this indicator, to what extent it can be used and can contribute to EU policy making. Eric?
Yes.
Yes, please.
Yes, many thanks.
Yes.
Yes. Many thanks also to Martin and colleagues for the very clear presentation. Indeed, I also appreciated much the presentation of Michaela, going into the work of the Joint Research Center to look into the indicator. My notes are a bit sketchy, so I'll try to turn it into a more or less consistent story. But a few observations I want to make. First, indeed, as you also mentioned in the introduction, when you come from, say, orthodox or mainstream economics, you think of competitiveness, typically in terms of labor productivity or unit labor cost. This is also how I have worked on the topic in the past. It was also interesting to notice when I came to the European Commission in 2013, it was the aftermath of the financial crisis. And I was then in DG ECFIN, so Economic and Financial Affairs. And there I noticed in the European semester, there was, the emphasis in the country reports was typically on the, say, more narrow definition of competitiveness, economic growth, productivity, etc. And over time, there was a clear change, actually, in the whole narrative. So, a bit broadly put, not maybe super nuanced, but with the Juncker Commission, say the social dimension came clearly in. And with von der Leyen, the sustainability dimension. So, and actually, you know, the last years, the attention in the political debate has broadened even much more. So now it's also about resilience and economic security and strategic autonomy. So the attention of policymakers has been quite dispersed, so not only at the more narrow economic concepts, but also to many other dimensions. And actually what is also a bit behind this is that we also believe in a, say, in a European model, a European economic model, which is maybe not, say, directly comparable to other economic models in the world, such as the model in the US. So the fact that we have stronger social security, there is something behind that. And it's not, it cannot be seen as something independent, as something you just want to plug into your dashboard, but there is a philosophy behind it. And that also puts forward, for example, the importance of the social contract. So basically, many problems we face in society, they can only be solved if you have a strong government, and you only can have a strong government if you have a strong social contract. So basically, and to have a strong social contract, you need indeed to have the social dimension central in your policymaking process. So I think this is this also illustrates that say the direct comparison with other economies in the world should always be put in perspective. So certain metrics in other countries we may indeed also try to achieve, but maybe in other metrics we may be a bit more cautious. Then I cannot resist to say, to put also a bit, a few more technical points. But I must also immediately add that these technical comments are generally applicable to any composite indicator and any dashboard. So when you have these discussions about dashboards and composite indicators, there are often similar comments that come back. The first one, indeed, and it was already mentioned earlier, is delays in the publication process. So, indeed, often dashboards published in 24, they rely on data in 22. It's a fact of life. We cannot do much about it, basically, yeah, but I think it's good to keep in mind. A second issue is that you know, some indicators are based on stocks, others on flows, and you know, you can ask yourself the question if you can always put them together. Sometimes indicators are based on perceptions, subjective data, survey data, and in other cases, data is more objective, if you like. So there can also be differences like that. Another one is that sometimes a higher score on an indicator is always good, but in other cases not. So, for example, if you look at inequality, I think no one will contest in the room that we want to have perfectly equal incomes. So maybe inequality is too high, maybe we should reduce it, but maybe it shouldn't go back to zero. So where is then the optimal level? Also, it should be noticed that preferences differ across countries. People, for example, express different voting preferences across countries. They differ over time. And actually also the issues that people are facing and are concerned about are also changing. I already mentioned this kind of broadening narrative. And when you know, a couple of years ago, maybe we couldn't have thought that the whole greening discussion would be so center stage at the moment. And you know, of course, also with the pandemic, things change. With the energy crisis, now with the tensions and the war in Ukraine. So the whole political landscape has changed a lot, and it's basically kind of impossible for dashboards to keep up, basically. And that brings me to the more the part more related to policy making and the policy process. Indeed, I remember when I was working for ECFIN, we were the unit had also in the title benchmarking. So what we were doing is we were looking at specific topics and then trying to benchmark the performance of European countries. And that often triggered quite interesting discussions, I must say. So we had lengthy discussions with member states on individual indicators, which one to use, which one not to use, but also on the scores of these indicators. So sometimes when a country scores not so good on an indicator, there is a whole story behind it. And also it kind of showed how difficult it is to reach consensus about across the member states on which indicators you want to systematically use in your policy work. So basically what is done in the European semester and in the country reports and in the country-specific recommendations. So there was always this fear that the Commission would make a direct kind of almost mechanical link between the scores on the indicators and the recommendations. So we always had to tell the member states, no, this is not the case. The dashboards are used as an important input, but there is never a mechanical link with country-specific recommendations. So we always try in the country reports to develop a narrative. So when we encounter a certain issue, a certain problem in a country, we try to go deeper and try to understand what's exactly going on. And then we use basically whatever robust evidence is available. So in other words, in that sense, we kind of look around what kind of data dashboards are available. And Michaela already mentioned that there are so many dashboards around now. So in that sense, it's a bit of a luxury problem, which actually also then, and I should have started with this, but also just to express my appreciation for this work, because all these different dashboards and scoreboards, they always add pieces to the puzzle. So we greatly welcome this work. I think it is greatly supporting our country desk work. And indeed, sometimes the issues require a specific set of indicators, which are in the dashboards or not. So sometimes you have to look for other sources. The last thing I want to mention is indeed that this type of work indeed also clearly gives insights into the broader policy trade-offs, if you want. So what I really like about this index is that it is organized around the structure as put forward in the annual sustainable growth strategy. So the document that kicks off the European semester process. So it really pays attention not only to the economic side, but also to social governance and the environment. And I think this is really a big advantage of this approach, I would say, because it really tries to present this more systemic narrative of all these four elements. And it also does helps to kind of get an idea of the trade-off. So if Martin has showed the rankings between countries on these four dimensions, and sometimes you see things moving together, but in other cases not. And it is very good to be aware of those trade-offs. But then I could also mention that these trade-offs are typically not necessarily say something that is kind of unchangeable or deterministic. Yeah? So of course, as policymakers, we try to alleviate these trade-offs also. So when you notice a trade-off between economic objectives and social objectives, for example, we try to think of mechanisms to soften these trade-offs. And Yeah, but indeed, as mentioned, I think this work is an enrichment to the whole debate on the growth model in Europe. It will certainly also help the country desk work and the development of the narratives in the various countries. And indeed, I think it really brings together this systemic approach, which, and then indeed, I will. This is my last comment. So I'm now in DG Research in the team of the chief economist, and we work with an external expert group, and various members in the room are also part of this expert group. It's called ESIR, Economic and Societal Impact of Research. And one of the recent policy briefs of ESIR is also developing this more broad narrative on competitiveness. So indeed moving a bit away from the more narrow focus in the Draghi report, but really emphasizing this systemic approach. And I think the work of this index also perfectly fits in that tradition. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much. If you allow me, before I give the floor to Heather, just one comment. I think one of the point that Eric highlighted is really related to the data. I was discussing during the break also with some of the previous speakers. So the ability to go back in time, but also to have maybe not real time, but quite on time. Data is quite critical if you want to use this indicator for policy purpose. And maybe just to share an experience on another area, I've been working quite a lot on the labor market. And on the labor market, the delay in the data is actually quite pervasive. And we had a meeting in this room exactly 1 year ago. It was an occasion of the European Year of Skills. So we collected quite a lot of people, all the European agencies, but also data providers, to actually understand whether big data, there is a lot of big data now out and is being used, maybe sometimes in a very selective way. So try to make an effort actually to combine the systematized data that we have, mostly provided by Eurostat and in the European Union, with some new data sources and big data to try to take advantage from basically the pluses of each of these data sources. This is not an easy exercise, but actually could provide a big addition in terms of having more up-to-date, if not really real-time data, because I think this is a key feature if you want to use this indicator for a policy purpose. But with this, I would like to give the floor to Heather for comments.
Thank you very much, Cinzia, and to SEPS and to CISL for the invitation. So I'm Heather Graby, Senior Fellow at Bruegel. I'm also a member of the working group of experts that Eric just mentioned at DG RTD on the economic and social parts of innovation. And what I'm going to do is actually give you no data at all. Right? You've seen a lot of statistics this afternoon. It's been tortured, it's been hashed. We've seen many alternatives. I'm just going to give you 3 very fundamental arguments about why, narratives perhaps. I think that when I was at university, we used to call them arguments. These days, they are called political narratives. But essentially, they are fundamental reasons why resource efficiency is right at the heart of Europe's long-term competitive sustainability. And as Davide set out in the report, it's there very much in the CISL report. It's also there in ESIR, the ESIR group for DG RTD's most recent report on competitiveness. And it's partially there in the Draghi report, and it's much more there in the letter report. But it kind of appears and disappears. Eric was just telling us about how narratives have changed over the past 10 years. They've changed even more dramatically as a result of the pandemic and then the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, showing the fragility of supply chains, just how much we in Europe are dependent on imports, not only of face masks and ventilators and so on, but also of just the fundamental raw materials for making things here. But somehow, as life kind of returned to normal after the pandemic and after the big push on energy, energy security, we seem to have forgotten that those enormous vulnerabilities are still there. So what I want to do is to make the argument to you. There are three reasons why this is absolutely fundamental to the long-term competitive sustainability, both on the positive side and also on the negative side. So just to start with the negative side, we in Europe are extraordinarily dependent because we are energy poor, right? We discovered that when Putin invaded the Ukraine. We have very few sources of fossil fuel energy. Therefore, we really don't have any choice but to move to renewable energy, actually. We really don't, because it's so expensive for us to import LNG and so on. We're also really rather poor in resources. We don't do very much mining. We're trying to do more mining, but look at the enormous debate about lithium. Both mining and processing enormously contested by local communities because it's environmentally damaging. It uses lots and lots of water. And these are things which are going to be in shorter and shorter supply in the future. So climate impacts actually make our resource poverty deeper. And it's where the water resilience strategy, for example, is also very much part of, we haven't mentioned that really much today, but the water resilience strategy, and especially the Circular Economy Act, are going to be fundamental to ensuring the longer term competitive sustainability. So I'm very much hoping that the competitiveness compass will put those things front and center, not as nice to have, pretty green add-ons, but really fundamental to the strategy. So we have this import dependence. We're really quite poor in resources. We're also, of course, poor, as Michaela was pointing out, in biodiversity, nature, which is really important for health, actually. It's not, again, it's not just a kind of nice, pretty pictures. There are plenty of health, food security issues, and so on. Enrico Letta put this very clearly in his report, where he said we cannot have economic security if we don't move to a much more circular economy, because we remain dependent, these are his words, we remain dependent on autocratic regimes which can cut off supplies at any time. So that's on energy, but it can also be on all kinds of other things, including critical raw materials, but also lots of other things. We are dependent on volatile commodity markets. Look at how, okay, so this is the one statistic I'm going to give you. Lithium prices have gone like this, and they've gone like that, and then they've gone back up again. So, okay, that's as technical as it's going to get. But volatile commodity prices, we're especially vulnerable to them because we don't produce the commodities themselves. And of course, there's simply the factor that global supply chains can be disrupted by geopolitical crises. And unfortunately, we're likely to have more of those, certainly over the next 5 years, looking at US leadership. So Letta is right about this. And he also, I think he doesn't stress perhaps enough how much more expensive inputs could become of all kinds, also because of climate impacts elsewhere in the world. Wildfires, extreme heat, floods, and so on, that disrupt supply chains. It drives up prices. And given that we are already dependent on those, there's a risk of cutting off supplies, but there's also a risk of simply things becoming much more expensive. Now, Mario Draghi, on page 432 of part B of his report, we really read these things at Bruegel, has a very nice section on critical raw materials and how dangerous Europe's dependencies are. And he makes the case for a circular economy, mainly around CRMs. Very nice section on CRMs. But CRMs are just the beginning of the story. It's not just critical raw materials for clean tech. It's really a much wider set of inputs. In fact, Ramon Arjona, chief economist at ECFIN, did a very nice paper for the Center for Economic Policy Research on import dependencies of the EU, where he looks at several hundred different import dependencies, critical import dependencies that the EU has, and says, well, of course, the answer is going to be the Net Zero Industry Act and the Critical Raw Materials Act. We need to move on from that. We've got this, there's a lot more to be done on all of that. So we've got to move beyond CRMs. But one point that Draghi makes in his report, which is really fundamental, is he says we have a perverse incentive in the European Union because of the fact that virgin materials the prices of primary raw materials do not reflect their environmental impact. There's no environmental pricing around them. We're going to start having carbon pricing around them with CBAM and so on, but we don't look at their water impact, their pollution impact, and so on. So, and he says the economics would change fundamentally if the environmental externalities were internalized, which is economic speak for pricing the costs that are borne by those who are living in the communities where these things are produced. So that's going to be fundamental too. But now I want to give you two really positive arguments why the European Union really should move much faster in resource efficiency. We've had a big energy efficiency drive with Fit for 55. It's great. We've never had an equivalent resource efficiency drive. But the EU is nevertheless quite ahead on setting standards that promote circularity principles. And we also have world-leading companies, which are actually really good at this. Some of them are big companies like, say, Veolia, Suez. Some of them are quite small companies. Italy has a lot of SMEs, which are really good at circularity, for example, and which are starting to export solutions to other parts of the world. But we're ahead on standards thanks to various circular economy packages and so on. Ursula von der Leyen rightly pointed out in the mission letter to the new Environment Commissioner about the need to establish secondary markets or to establish markets for secondary raw materials and to set norms and standards for those. But in fact, the secondary raw materials, that's kind of at the end of the chain. There's a great deal more that could be done much earlier on in the life cycle of products. So yes, we do need to have better standards for example, remanufacturing, because foam from inside your car seats shouldn't really become foam inside teddy bears if it doesn't meet toy standard regulations. So you need to have these standards and you need to establish a market. And it's really important that the single market uses its economies of scale in doing this. To give you an example of that, on waste, for example, you need specialist recycling facilities for many kinds of waste. So you have to be able to transport waste across borders, which can't be done at the moment under the waste regulation, in order to have that kind of specialist recycling, in order to, for example, take the components out of this thing and use the gold and the lithium and all the other things that are in here at scale to produce new materials. So the scale part of the single market is really fundamental. The standard setting is fundamental. And also, we can see the way that eco-design, so not just extended producer responsibility and eco-design as we have it now, but to make that, to push that into new sectors would make a huge difference. There's a very interesting, in a paper that we did for Bruegel, if I may be allowed to mention another think tank and a different report, but we did a report which came out in September on circular economy or circular single market for Europe, in which we cited the ways in which particularly about 80% of the environmental impacts for most products can actually be eliminated in the design phase. So it's not primarily about recycling. That's the very end. That should be the last resort. It's about the design phase. And that's not just for products. It's also for buildings. For example, if you design a building to be used for 200 years and with multiple reuses and ways of remodeling it, then you don't have the demolition creating all the construction waste and hazards and traffic jams and all these other unpleasant things. And then the other key reason for doing this is it will make us more competitive. Short term, because we are much more resilient to external shocks, but long term, because Europe's comparative advantage is not going to lie in resource intensive or indeed energy intensive industries. Often we talk about sectors, is our competitive future going to be in cars or in pharma? Or in aviation, but it may well be in sectors that are still fledgling, which are still developing. And so we need to reveal the hidden inefficiencies in the current economy in order to help those sectors to develop. Rather than protecting sectors that may become redundant with public money, I would argue we should be investing, and this is where the innovation agenda comes in the kinds of circular sectors which can become the champions, European champions of the future. And that will be really important because this is an export market too. Lots of countries are, in fact, basically all countries are really struggling with waste. In developing countries, typically 25% of municipal budgets go on waste management. like 25%. If you are a poor village in Kenya, that's a lot of money to have a quarter of your municipal budget going on waste management. If, say, and there are lots of nice examples of this, you've got a European firm which has developed very sophisticated waste management techniques, they can often apply those in other countries to help them to implement a recycling system, to start a waste management set of solutions, which will save money, which will bring more competitiveness to European firms, and which, of course, are going to be better for the planet. So finally, this is an area clearly for leadership by the Commission, because the Commission has really got tools to do this, for the standard setting, for single market scale, and also doing long-term policy making across electoral cycles, kind of riding across the bumps that are coming on a lot of the competitive sustainability agenda. So I'd really like to see the Commission in the Competitiveness Compass and also the Circular Economy Act, which is going to be, I think, going to come out next year, looking at resource efficiency as a fundamental part of competitive sustainability to 2050.
Thank you very much. For these three compelling, I would say, arguments. So I would like now to open the floor for questions because we are approaching 5:15. Whoever has a question, please raise your hand. And so I see the gentleman there.
Hello, Jan Nil, European Commission, DG ECFIN Green Transition Team. Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I think one thing is very useful is that also the different compartments resonate with people. So for example, when you say, okay, you see also industry bad or bad economic indicators, that helps also to communicate on such an indicator with people which perhaps look into another competitiveness world. The competitiveness compass was mentioned. I would urge everyone to read it in the future together also with the Clean Industrial Deal, which comes a month later, because only those two together probably will provide a picture which is relevant for the debate today. And the third is one technical argument, which I hesitated to do, but as I've seen how prominent you put it in the report, I have to do it. I worked quite a lot on fossil fuel subsidies lately, including a published paper. And you use IMF data, and I have two questions on this IMF data. First, data is measured to reference market prices. So I don't think it measures mainly the competitiveness, it measures the social aspects, because what it mainly measures is the countries, if countries regulate energy prices. And when you look, why do countries regulate energy prices, this has often a social dimension. So, but perhaps, I don't know which data you use, but that is for worth checking, and I think the message taken from it is a bit overdone, although tempting.
Thank you so much. And let me introduce myself. I'm Valvanera Ulargui. I'm working at Rivera's cabinet, coordinating the green cluster. And thank you for the analysis. Thank you for the recommendations. Are very timely. We are in the first 100 days of the new commission, and it's very important to base on good data, to base on good recommendation, and also on science-based analysis in order, to work on the next policies cycle. I think that we fully agree with many of the narratives that you mentioned. I think that it's important for policymakers, but also for the business community, to integrate this both aspect, sustainability and competitiveness in the same analysis. Also, it's an opportunity to tell positive stories and to build upon what we have already launched in the previous year at European level that really delivers. I'm talking about, how the sustainable finance work is delivering, how the sustainable finance work is also reconducted investment to the green projects that creates also competitiveness on the energy part, but also on the social aspects. I was also worried about, because we have in mind since many years on the environmental performance of the member states, and also how important is to make it profitable and to make the business case for environment to industries, but also to the public administration. So how we can work on this new approach in which we integrate the different elements that make us, you know, more competitiveness within us and also outside, and especially, you know, how we can integrate the non-pricing criteria in the next initiatives, because we know, you know, that we have integrated the carbon prices under ETS. That is complex, but it also brings very good results on the decarbonization of the economy. But how can we make the next step at policy level in dematerialization, you know, our economy, and also in integrating the social aspect and non-criteria based on the data? So it's a tricky question and a complex one, but try to integrate, you know, the main elements that were highlighted. And I totally agree with the not barriers, but the challenges that we need to do the things differently in a way that we produce policies, but also in the way we attract investment to Europe. Thank you.
So, hi, thank you. Katarina Maskant from Teneo, where I advise different companies on sustainability policy broadly. I've been here more than 20 years, so sorry if I'm trying to get some excitement about the Circular Economy Act, because some of these things we talked about probably as long as I've been here, but maybe now it will actually happen. Because when you talk to corporates, if it's one thing they've known for quite some time, is that the first wave of sustainability initiatives was about saving money, less energy use, less resources. So everyone was very excited we're probably talking 10 years from now. So I think that's well understood in the business kind of context. Just to take us back to the current discussion on what we're expecting to see, I suppose the 29th, this is now pushed again. We know very little, but we know there's 3 pillars, and I had to quickly write them down. One is the investment gap, EU versus China, and then also US been mentioned by von der Leyen herself. It's also the decarbonization and competitiveness. Of course, the Green Industrial Deal will be key, including with financing, but also economic security. So I see very little, unfortunately, about the resource question. So, I mean, maybe to you, Martin, and to the rest of your panel, what likelihood do you see of resources and some of this very good work that you've done here, very comprehensive, you know, coming through in the end proposal? Do you have any feedback or reflections or anything like that? Thank you.
Thank you. Let me take the first question on the IMF data. I'm going to refer you to my colleague David, who will come back to you on the specifics of that. But it's a good point, but also, I think, consistent with, to some extent, the message that Michaela gave. I draw from that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And we've survived so far, and I hope that with all the feedback, obviously we've had a lot of scrutiny and feedback from the JRC. We've had many discussions, not exactly like this, with others who've made critiques, comments, and so on. We're not trying to be perfect. We just want to initiate a debate almost within a framework that moves us on from an orthodoxy which doesn't work. And this is a step along that road rather than the end point. But I think we need to think differently now. And the index is an attempt to do that. It's a first attempt. It's still in progress, and we've got ideas to develop it. And on the data, for example, not just the concept, on biodiversity, on resources, the international availability of that data has been poor. It's in development. We need the equivalent of a Paris Agreement for biodiversity, which is in progress but not there, and on resources, because that not only provides the data, but it gives you a framework within which you can work. So the climate data can be aligned to a long-term target, which we don't quite have with biodiversity and resources, for example. So that's in progress. There are lots of initiatives by many organizations to try to improve those points of data, and we will try to make sure we're referencing those so that we improve the index. But it's collaborative, obviously. It needs many organizations to work on these issues. To the point about the the compass that will come out, the index is an attempt to look long term about the strategic competitive challenge that we all face, that the European Union faces. To that extent, it links very much with the type of comment that Enrico mentioned, namely, we should be proposing something which we see other countries would see has value as a measurement system. And then you can compare countries on resources and on how you achieve the necessary protection of biodiversity, climate emissions reduction, social levels of equality, if not lower inequality, so that you're measuring competitiveness in a consistent way. And I think what our index starts to show is that the type of comment Heather made about resource productivity, resource efficiency, it's a poor relation in our discussion about competitiveness. And it shouldn't be. We know strategically over the next 20 or 30 years, we have to be 10 times, orders of magnitude, more efficient in our use of natural resources. And if we are first in that and are better at it, our companies are the ones who are leading on it, because we have helped shape that international agenda, then in principle, we will also derive some of the other economic and social benefits from that. It's an inevitable thing that we will have to do because we can see the planetary boundary conditions that we're all facing. So I think if we're ahead of the game in trying to measure competitiveness as well as sustainable and inclusive well-being, the EU will be in a better position long term. And I think this is a point that was made. Actually, there are some more positive stories that come out of the index than you would hear if you talk to some of the partial views, if I would say. I'm not saying that they are wrong, but you will often have individual areas of economic activity which are particularly exposed and stressed in the short term. And they're quite right to say we are in really serious trouble now. But this is a strategic long-term approach. And the compass, if it is to be really effective, needs to take not a 5-year, but actually a 25-year or 30-year perspective on our strategic competitive goals. And they should embed economic, environmental, and social and governance conditions as well. We're in a struggle actually to defend liberal democracy and many of the values that the EU in its Article 3, which I'd forgotten about until today, that's the end, actually. It's one of the ends that we should be articulating. That's part of a competitive agenda. It isn't a separate one. It needs to be integrated in it. So I guess with that, I would say that we have an opportunity, I think, to develop the beginnings of that model. And the short-term response, if it's a crisis response, needs to have that longer-term perspective in mind. And I think Draghi, actually, there's a lot in the index which is very supportive of what Draghi has concluded. But there are some bits which he called for radical thinking, and he's quite orthodox in some of his approaches. He should be, or we should be, the additional unorthodox approach that makes it truly competitively sustainable. Because otherwise we will be facing the same problem in 3 or 5 or 10 years' time, and in a worse condition, competitively on economic and social and sadly possibly environmental grounds too. And this is immediate in those terms. We know that the environmental crisis is not something we can just ignore. I heard somebody say the other day, you can stick your head in the sand and hope something solves itself, but when you bring your head out, it's still going to be there, this problem. So that won't help us. So I would just hope that this is a contribution to that debate. And I think it's the flip side to the discussion we had in the first half of this conference today. It very much looks at the same dilemma or challenge through the competitiveness lens, as opposed to the lens of the sort of macro perspective of economic and social development, which is very much needs to be brought together.
Thanks very much, Martin. Thanks very much, Eric, Heather, and Michaela for your contribution. Many thanks to all of you for the question and for staying with us. We are 10 minutes late, so I'm a little bit in a hurry to close. And thanks again, and have a good evening. Bye.
Yeah, this is what I wanted to make, but I forgot. The purpose, what's the purpose?